Section 1, the Springfield Nuclear Plant Conspiracy. Let's start with the one that quietly explains everything else. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant. It sits at the edge of town in almost every establishing shot, cooling towers against the sky, that perpetual yellow haze drifting from its stacks. It's part of the scenery, it's wallpaper. After a few episodes, you stop really seeing it, and that's exactly the problem because once you start actually looking at what the show has been telling you about that building for over 3 decades, you cannot unsee it. The plant is a 2 unit pressurized water reactor facility. It is the sole provider of electrical power for the entire town of Springfield. It is owned and operated by Charles Montgomery Burns, a man whose age, by the most conservative reading of the show's own timeline, places him well past 100 years old. And the facility he runs has, across hundreds of episodes, been depicted as one of the most catastrophically mismanaged industrial sites in the history of fiction. A surprise safety inspection, one single inspection, uncovered 342 violations. Not two violations, not 12, 342 separate failures to meet the minimum legal standards for operating a nuclear facility. The estimated cost to bring the plant into compliance was $56 million. Burns refused to pay it. And this is important because Burns is not struggling financially. He is a billionaire many times over, a man who once hoarded a $1 trillion bill, a man whose personal source wealth effectively underwrites the entire local economy of Springfield. The money was never the issue. Burns refused to fix the violations because fixing them would mean acknowledging they existed, and acknowledging they existed would open a door he had spent decades making sure nobody could find. So, what exactly were those violations? The show doesn't keep this vague. It tells you directly, episode after episode, in that casual throwaway way that makes you laugh and move on before the information has fully landed. Radioactive waste being dumped directly into local waterways. Radioactive waste deposited on children's playgrounds. Plutonium being used as a paperweight on an employee's desk. Cooling towers held together in places by chewing gum. Rats in the facility that have absorbed enough radiation to glow. And then dropped into one episode like it's nothing, something the show never bothers to explain. Human skeletons in the basement, not one skeleton. Skeletons, plural. Human remains inside an operational nuclear reactor, and the show just moves past it. The safety inspection notes the bones. Nobody investigates. Nobody asks who those people were or how they ended up there. The bones are just another item on a very long list, and the man whose job it is to prevent all of this from happening, the safety inspector of record for this facility, is Homer Simpson, a man whose IQ the show's own creator has placed at 55. A man who, in one episode, discovers that a crayon has been physically lodged in his brain since childhood, mechanically suppressing his cognitive function in ways that a doctor describes as significant. A man who once caused a nuclear incident by throwing a donut into the reactor core to see if the radiation would make it grow. That is the person standing between Springfield and radioactive catastrophe. That is the last line of defense. And he has been standing there for over 30 years. Now, here is where this stops being a collection of jokes and starts being something else entirely. Because the show doesn't just give you the plant and the violations and the incompetent inspector, it gives you the consequences. And once you line up those consequences in order, the picture they form is stark. Season 2. A fisherman pulls a three-eyed fish from a river near the power plant. The fish, named Blinky by the press, becomes national news within the show's universe. A gubernatorial candidate uses Blinky as campaign evidence that Burns is poisoning the local environment. The story gets enough traction that Burns is forced to eat the fish on live television to prove it's safe for consumption. He sits there at a table, forks it into his mouth, smiles for the cameras, and the town watches and shrugs and moves on. Nobody tests the water. Nobody conducts a follow-up study. Nobody asks the logical next question, which is, if whatever's in that river gave a fish a third eye, what has it been doing to the people who have been drinking that water their entire lives? The show doesn't answer that question directly, but it has been answering it quietly in the background through the design of every character who has ever lived in Springfield. Look at the residents. Look at them the way you'd look at a population chart if you were an epidemiologist trying to identify a cluster of anomalies. Homer has a skull shape that doesn't correspond to any known human cranial structure. His overbite is severe. His eyes bulge. He has 4 fingers on each hand. His IQ qualifies as a clinical disability. His body can absorb trauma that would kill a normal person with unsettling regularity. When he's shot, electrocuted, thrown from heights, hit by vehicles, and caught in explosions, and he walks away from all of it not because of cartoon physics, but because something in his biology has been altered. His healing rate is inhuman. His pain tolerance operates on a completely different scale from any baseline human being. Marge has the same bulging eyes, the same four fingers, hair that has maintained a physically impossible vertical tower structure for 3 decades without any apparent effort or product. She worked at the plant herself briefly and was exposed to the same environment as Homer. Their 3 children, Bart, Lisa, Maggie, were all conceived and born after both parents had already spent years absorbing whatever Springfield's contaminated environment produces. And all 3 of them carry the same physical markers: the spiky hair, the overbite, the forefingers, the eyes, and then there's the skin. Every single person in Springfield is yellow, not slightly tanned, not olive toned, not ambiguously drawn. Yellow, a shade that has no equivalent in any real human population anywhere on Earth. And for years, audiences accepted this as a stylistic choice, as part of the show's visual identity, because that's what you do when something is presented as normal from the very beginning. You accept it as the baseline and stop questioning it. But here's the detail that makes that acceptance much harder to hold on to. When people come to Springfield from outside the town, celebrities, guest characters, visitors from other cities, they look different. Noticeably, fundamentally different. Their proportions are more naturalistic. Their eyes sit differently in their faces. Their features more closely approximate actual human anatomy. The show draws outsiders with a visual grammar that is observably distinct from the visual grammar it uses for Springfield's permanent residents. The standard explanation is that this is just an artistic shorthand, a way of making visiting characters feel distinct from the regular cast. And that might be true from a production standpoint. But within the logic of the show's own universe, what you are observing is a visible, documented difference between people who live inside the contamination zone and people who don't. The people inside the zone look one way. The people outside it look another. That is not a style choice once you've accepted the show's internal reality as a real place with real rules. That's a symptom chart. Even the animals carry it. Santa's little helper, the Simpson family greyhound, has the same proportional distortions as his owners, the same eye shape, the same structural exaggerations. Blinky the fish is a mutation the show presents as direct evidence of radioactive contamination. And the show then asks you to accept that the same contamination has had zero biological effect on the humans living in that environment. Season 8 brings this to a head in a way the show itself seems to recognize, even if it refuses to state it outright. Homer sees a glowing figure in the woods near Springfield. He becomes convinced it's an alien. The FBI sends agents. The whole town panics and investigates, and then the episode reveals what's actually out there. It's Mr. Burns. Burns has been undergoing a weekly medical treatment so intensive, so loaded with experimental chemicals and radiation therapy, that his body temporarily emits a visible green glow afterward. He emerges from each session in a disoriented, euphoric state and wanders through the nearby woods before he's coherent enough to return home. He literally produces light. His body has absorbed enough radiation, through either direct exposure or deliberate treatment, that it glows in the dark. And the people of Springfield see this figure glowing in the forest, and their immediate conclusion is alien visitor from outer space. Not a person. Not someone from the power plant that looms over their skyline. An alien. The denial required to arrive at that conclusion, to look at a glowing humanoid figure near a nuclear facility and not make the obvious connection, is a kind of cognitive failure so complete it stops looking like stupidity and starts looking like damage. The Simpsons movie took all of this ambient evidence and pushed it to its logical extreme. Springfield's environmental contamination reaches a level so catastrophic during the film that the Environmental Protection Agency, an actual federal regulatory body operating within the show's internal reality, determines that the town must be physically isolated. A massive dome is lowered over Springfield to prevent its pollution from spreading to the rest of the country. Sit with what that means. The United States government looked at one specific American town and concluded that the only viable solution was permanent containment. Springfield isn't just a polluted city. It is classified by the federal government as an environmental hazard so severe that exposure to it cannot be permitted to reach the outside world. The town is a contamination zone. Every resident who has been drinking its water, breathing its air, and living downwind of those cracked cooling towers, they're still inside when the dome comes down. They were always inside. Burns knows. The show makes this clear not through any dramatic confession, but through the accumulation of details as about how Burns manages his own survival. He has personal physicians. He funds private medical research. He undergoes weekly treatments that are, by the show's own description, so extreme that they keep him alive for exactly one additional week before another dose is required. Miss a treatment, and he dies. His margin for error is zero. Burns understands what radiation does to biological systems because radiation is the thing that is keeping him alive. His body has been so altered by a century of proximity to nuclear material that it can no longer sustain itself through conventional cellular processes. He requires external radiation input, the way a normal human body requires food and sleep. Take it away, and his systems collapse within days. And Burns has access to all of this because of the plant. The plant funds his research. The plant gives him his monopoly. The plant keeps Springfield economically dependent on him in ways that prevent any organized resistance from forming. He knows what the plant is doing to the people of Springfield, not in spite of being its owner, but because he is its owner. He has been watching the experiment from the inside for decades. Homer's continued employment is not an oversight. When the plant was briefly sold to German investors, the first thing they did was fire Homer. The second thing they did was assess the full cost of bringing the facility into compliance and nearly went bankrupt from the number. Burns bought the plant back almost immediately and rehired Homer on the first day. A competent safety inspector would shut that plant down within a week of starting the job. Homer ensures the violations continue because Homer cannot perceive them clearly enough to act on them. And that perceptual failure is, at minimum, extremely convenient for Burns. The crayon episode. Season 12 reveals that Homer once had the crayon removed from his brain, and the transformation was immediate and complete. His IQ spiked to genius level. He became articulate, perceptive, capable of understanding complex systems. For a brief period, Homer Simpson was the most insightful person in Springfield. He saw his job for what it was, he saw the plant for what it was, he saw the architecture of his own exploitation, and found it unbearable. Not because intelligence is painful, but because clarity in a place like Springfield is a kind of curse. You can see everything that's wrong and also see that you lack the power to change any of it, and that combination is apparently worse than not seeing it at all. So Homer had the crayon put back in. He chose the fog. He chose to return to a state in which the world was comprehensible again, even if that comprehensibility was a product of his inability to understand what was really happening. But the question the show doesn't ask, and the one that lingers if you sit with it, is how a crayon got lodged in a child's brain in the first place and stayed there through Homer's entire childhood, his entire adolescence, every physical examination he ever had as an adult in Springfield, without a single doctor finding it. Either Springfield's medical establishment is catastrophically incompetent, or someone in that establishment knew it was there and had reasons to leave it alone. And if Burns's influence extends into the town's healthcare infrastructure, if the doctors who serve Springfield's population are part of the same system that Burns built and maintains, then Homer's crayon becomes something darker than a childhood accident. It becomes a detail in a much longer plan. The radiation theory doesn't explain one specific mystery about The Simpsons. It explains the structure of the whole thing. The characters don't age because their mutated biology has been altered at a level that interferes with normal cellular progression. The town resets after catastrophic events because its population's capacity for collective memory and critical response has been degraded by decades of neurological exposure. Homer survives injuries that should kill him because his body has adapted to radiation in ways that have made him genuinely durable, even at the cost of nearly everything else. Burns remains alive through treatments that would kill any normal human because he has spent a century constructing the infrastructure required to keep himself alive. And nobody in Springfield asking these questions because the same substance that mutated their bodies also compromised the part of their brains responsible for asking them. Springfield isn't a cartoon town with a nuclear plant in the background. Springfield is a contaminated ecosystem with a community inside it. The plant isn't set dressing. The plant is the explanation. Every yellow face, every four-fingered hand, every impossible recovery, every forgotten disaster, every unexplained mystery in 36 years of episodes, all of it traces back to the same cracked cooling towers, leaking the same invisible damage into the same water supply, feeding into the same population that has been slowly, quietly, irrevocably changed by the thing that powers their lights and pays their neighbor's salary. The plant is the show. It has always been the show. If you're watching this late at night, go ahead and drop your location and the time in the comments. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We're going to be here a while, and it only gets stranger from here. Section 2. Homer's coma. The theory that reframes everything now. Take everything you just heard about the radiation and the plant and the mutations. Hold it in your mind. And then consider the possibility that every single word of it is true, but only inside the imagination of a man who has been unconscious since 1993. This is the Homer coma theory. It is, by most measures, the most widely discussed, most internally consistent, and most emotionally affecting fan theory in the entire history of The Simpsons. And the reason it persists isn't because it's a clever trick. It's because the evidence for it is genuinely embedded in the show's own structure in ways that nobody from the production has ever fully addressed. Let's go back to April 1993, Season 4, Episode 18. The episode is called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise is straightforward enough. It's April Fool's Day. Bart is escalating a series of pranks on Homer, and the escalation eventually reaches the point where Bart takes one of Homer's beer cans to a body shop and puts it inside an industrial paint shaker. When Homer opens it, the explosion is violent enough to send him to the hospital. That's the setup. While Homer is lying in his hospital bed, he spots a vending machine across the room. He wants a candy bar. He reaches for it, the machine tips over, and it crushes him. He flatlines. He enters a clinically documented, medically confirmed coma. The show doesn't play this as a dream sequence. It doesn't frame it as a cutaway gag. Homer Simpson's heart stops, and he goes under. The episode ends with what appears to be a resolution. Bart tearfully confesses at Homer's bedside that the whole thing was his fault. Homer springs awake and immediately starts strangling Bart. The family laughs. Bart laughs. Homer laughs. Everything goes back to normal, and the show continues as if nothing significant happened. Except in the final moments of that same episode, the show drops a detail that it never returns to. During the coma, Homer lost 5% of his brain function. 5% permanently destroyed, never coming back. Homer's response upon learning this is to laugh, even though he explicitly says he doesn't understand why he's laughing. The family finds this charming rather than alarming. The episode ends. The theory argues that Homer never actually woke up, that the apparent awakening at Bart's bedside, the strangling, the laughter, the resumption of normal family life, all of it is the first scene of an unconscious man's dream. Homer's brain, receiving ambient stimuli from the hospital room, from the television in the corner, from conversations at his bedside, from the radio, began generating a continuous waking hallucination. A dream so detailed and so persistent that it has been running uninterrupted ever since. And the evidence for this is not subtle once you know to look for it. The first thing to examine is the tone shift. Before the coma episode, The Simpsons was, by any honest assessment, a different kind of show. Its storylines were rooted in recognizable domestic reality. Homer tried to stop drinking. Marge struggled with anxiety and considered professional help. Lisa developed a crush on a substitute teacher and processed the disappointment when he left. Bart faced the possibility of being held back a grade and had to confront what that meant for his future. These were not small, contained family problems exaggerated for comedy. These were the kinds of pressures that real working class American families actually experience, rendered through a comedic lens but fundamentally anchored in something true. After the coma, the show's reality begins to loosen. Gradually at first, then with increasing speed. Homer goes to space. Homer joins a secret society. Homer discovers his mother has been living underground as a fugitive radical for 30 years. Homer travels to dozens of countries, holds hundreds of different jobs, meets presidents, survives catastrophes, befriends celebrities. The show transforms from a domestic sitcom with economic anxiety at its core into something more like an anthology of increasingly surreal adventures, loosely connected by a recurring cast. The shift is so dramatic and so consistently remarked upon by longtime fans that the internet has been arguing about when The Simpsons lost its way for more than 2 decades. The coma theory offers a specific answer to that argument. The Simpsons didn't lose its way. Homer's brain got worse. The escalating surrealism, the increasingly cartoonish premises, the progressive loosening of physical and narrative logic, these aren't failures of the writing staff. They're symptoms of a deteriorating mind trying to sustain a coherent simulation with fewer and fewer functional resources. 6 months before the coma episode aired in the season 4 premiere, the show included an episode called Homer the Heretic. In this episode, Homer has a direct face-to-face conversation with God, an actual exchange played mostly for comedy but given genuine weight by the episode's emotional arc. And during that conversation, God tells Homer something specific. He tells him that he will one day understand the meaning of life, but not yet. God says that Homer's time is coming. 6 months later, Homer is in a coma. The timeline alignment is exact. God, speaking to Homer in October 1992, told him that his time was nearly up. And in April 1993, Homer's conscious experience of the world ended. What the show presents as a theological gag, Homer talking to God over breakfast, reads, under the coma theory, as a prophetic warning. God was telling Homer that his waking life was approaching its end. Everything that followed would be the dream of a man who ran out of time before he got to watch his children grow up. The aging problem is the piece of evidence that the coma theory handles better than any other explanation for the show's structure. Nobody in Springfield ages. Bart has been 10 years old for 36 years. Lisa's been 8. Maggie has been 1. Homer and Marge have not accumulated a single visible year. The floating timeline is the standard production explanation. The show's present is always the viewer's present, so the characters must remain at fixed ages to avoid the narrative complications of aging. Other animated shows do the same thing, and audiences generally accept it without much thought. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that this explanation starts to feel insufficient. Because it's not just that the characters don't age in a biological sense, it's that the emotional and developmental rhythms of their lives are also frozen. Bart never grows past his rebellion. Lisa never resolves her loneliness. Homer never meaningfully processes the losses that have shaped him. The show can imagine futures for these characters. It has done so in flash forward episodes that are often the most emotionally powerful things series has ever produced, but it cannot allow those futures to arrive. Something keeps the present locked in place. The coma theory provides the simplest explanation for this and the most devastating one. Nobody ages because they exist inside the mind of a man who went unconscious in April 1993. Homer's brain does not have the ability to imagine his children growing older because it was not present to observe that growth happening. The last time Homer consciously experienced his family, Bart was 10, Lisa was 8, Maggie was 1, Marge looked exactly like she always looked. His unconscious mind can only reproduce what it knew. It cannot generate new information about who these people have become because it never received that information. Homer's coma dream preserves his world at the exact moment he lost it. Every detail of Springfield, every routine, every relationship maintained at the precise temperature of April 1993 because that is the only Springfield Homer's brain has the data to reconstruct. The celebrity appearances deserve attention here as well because they're one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence against the coma theory. How critics ask, can Homer's brain generate accurate depictions of celebrities who became famous after 1993? How does his unconscious mind know what Lady Gaga looks like, or how Elon Musk talks, or what various specific cultural figures from the 2000s and 2010s looks and sound like? The theory answers this through the concept of ambient stimuli. Homer is in a hospital room. Hospitals have televisions, they have radios. Visitors come and go and have conversations. Nurses discuss current events. The building itself is filled with sound and fragments of a world Homer can no longer see directly. His unconscious mind, receiving these fragments through the fog of coma, processes them into the dream. A name heard from the television becomes a face in Springfield. A voice from a radio becomes a character with dialogue. Every celebrity who visits Springfield is, under this reading, a signal Homer received from the outside world and incorporated into his internal narrative. This also explains why later seasons of the show have a higher density of celebrity appearances than the earlier ones. It's not that Springfield became a more glamorous destination over time. It's that Homer's brain, receiving more ambient cultural information as years passed, had more raw material to work with. The dream got louder as the outside world kept broadcasting into the hospital room. The show has engaged with this theory directly, which is itself a kind of evidence. In season 34, a fake deleted scene was deliberately leaked in which Homer wakes up from a long coma and realizes that every outlandish episode was a dream. The scene was animated, it was voiced, it was produced with full resources, and then the show claimed it was a hoax, a piece of content planted by fictional hackers, and that Homer is definitely not in a coma. But the fact that they made it at all is its own kind of admission. The writers know the theory. They've thought about it seriously enough to animate a response to it. Their denial came wrapped inside an episode that explicitly depicted the very thing they were denying. They showed Homer waking up from a coma and told the audience it wasn't real. That is a strange way to rebuff a fan theory. It's the kind of move you make when you've lived with a theory long enough that you can't entirely dismiss it and can't entirely confirm it, so you do something in the middle that satisfies neither impulse. Executive producer Al Jean addressed the coma theory in 2015 and said simply that it isn't true. He dismissed it as fan speculation, and maybe it is. But Gene didn't explain the tonal shift after season 4. He didn't explain why God told Homer his time was coming 6 months before the coma. He didn't explain why nobody ages beyond the standard floating timeline response that doesn't really address the deeper strangeness of what it means for characters to exist in permanent stasis. He didn't explain why the show has become progressively more detached from recognizable reality with each passing decade, in exactly the pattern you'd expect from a brain that was losing function rather than gaining it. He said it wasn't true. The interviewer moved on. But the theory persists because the evidence it draws on is still there, still in the episodes, still arranged exactly the pattern as it was always arranged in. Here's the part worth sitting with. If the coma theory is accurate, then the emotional center of The Simpsons is not comedy at all. It's grief. It's the story of a man who lost his family at the moment of a vending machine falling on him in a hospital room, and whose unconscious mind has spent more than 3 decades refusing to accept that loss. Homer's brain generates Springfield as an act of love. It reconstructs Marge's voice and Bart's laugh and Lisa's saxophone and Maggie's eyes because these are the things worth holding on to. These are the things his dying mind will not let go of. In the dream, his children are always young. Bart will always be 10. Lisa will always be 8. Maggie will always be small enough to carry. The family will always be at home on Evergreen Terrace when the episode ends. The couch gag will always play. The theme music will always carry them back to the beginning. And every time Homer survives something that should have killed him, and the list of things that should have killed him is long. Every time the world resets between episodes as if the previous disaster never happened. Every time the credits roll and Springfield goes back to normal, that isn't lazy writing about consequence-free storytelling. That's Homer's brain refusing to let the narrative end. Because the narrative ending means the dream stopping. And the dream stopping means waking up. And waking up means finding out how much time has passed in the real world, how old Bart actually is now, whether Marge is still in the waiting room or went home years ago, whether anyone is still sitting by the bed. The coma theory doesn't diminish The Simpsons. It transforms every episode into something both smaller and more profound than entertainment. It makes the show into a 30-year love letter written by an unconscious father to the family he can't reach. Homer Simpson has been dreaming about the people he loves since April 1993. And every episode is just him refusing very stubbornly and very sweetly to wake up. Section 3. Who really shot Mr. Burns? The case is not closed. Before we talk about the evidence, let's acknowledge something. The show told you who did it. Season 7, Episode 1. Maggie Simpson pulled the trigger. Case closed. Baby did it. Move on. That's the official answer. The writers stand behind it. The DVD commentary treats it as settled. And yet, the mystery hasn't closed. Not really. Not for anyone who's spent real time with the details. Because when you go back and actually examine the evidence, not just accept the conclusion the show presents, but examine the evidence it lays out. The case develops cracks that don't go away no matter how carefully you try to seal them. Let's go back to the summer of 1995, Season 6, Episode 25, Who Shot Mr. Burns, Part 1. This was a genuinely unprecedented moment in animated television. No show had attempted a real whodunit cliffhanger before, not at this scale, not with this level of investment. Fox promoted it like an event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special treating the fictional shooting as if it were a real unsolved crime. The show invited viewers across the country to submit their guesses, with the winner to be animated into a future episode. This was cultural saturation. The Simpsons was not just a television show that summer. It was a national puzzle. And to make the puzzle work, the episode spent the entire first half of its runtime establishing motive for what amounts to every significant character in Springfield. Burns had spent the episode systematically destroying the town's community infrastructure for personal financial gain. He'd stolen an oil well from beneath Springfield Elementary, gutting the school's budget at the source. He'd economically crushed Moe's Tavern and driven its owner toward bankruptcy. He'd created a sinkhole that destroyed the Springfield Retirement Castle, displacing its elderly residents. He'd injured Santa's little helper, the Simpson family dog. He'd fired Smithers, his loyal assistant of decades, for expressing moral objection to his latest scheme. And for the finale, Burns unveiled a device designed to block the sun over the entire town. Not symbolically, not as a temporary measure. He built a mechanical disc capable of permanently blocking Springfield's sunlight, specifically so that Residents would have no choice but to purchase their electricity from his power plant. He held the town's access to sunlight hostage for profit. By the end of part one, every person in Springfield had a reason to want Burns dead. The show deliberately gave motives to Homer, whose name Burns had never learned despite years of employment, to Bart and Lisa, whose school had lost its funding, to Grandpa Simpson, whose retirement home had been destroyed, to groundskeeper Willie, who'd lost his job, to Tito Puente, whose music program had been cut, to Mo, whose bar was gone, even to Smithers, freshly fired, humiliated, and spiraling. The entire town gathered at a public meeting to confront Burns. Multiple characters were shown in possession of weapons. The tension built. Burns appeared, and then the screen went black. One shot. Burns fell, staggered to the town sundial, collapsed with his hands landing on two letters. Summer arrived. America waited. When part two aired, the investigation played out as a comedic procedural. Smithers confessed immediately, but his confession fell apart. He had been blackout drunk at the time of the shooting, and it turned out had actually shot someone else entirely. Old Jasper, in his wooden leg, on a different street, not Burns. Suspects were eliminated one by one through alibis and contradictory evidence. Tito Puente produced what is legitimately one of the greatest alibis in television history, a full musical number demonstrating that he channeled his rage into artistic expression rather than violence. Principal Skinner was accounted for. Mo was accounted for. Then police found an eyelash on Burns's suit. DNA testing matched it to a Simpson. Homer had the clearest established motive. Homer's fingerprints were on the gun. Homer was arrested. He was close to being convicted. And then Burns woke up and identified his shooter as Maggie. He described an encounter in the parking lot after the town meeting where he attempted to take Maggie's lollipop. His gun fell from his holster in the struggle. Maggie picked it up, and the weapon discharged. Burns was shot with his own gun by a baby who was reaching for it. Mystery solved. Except the contest that was supposed to validate the solution found that, out of the thousands of entries submitted, not a single person from the randomly selected sample guessed the correct answer. Not one. The producers noted on the DVD commentary that they were aware of one person who posted the correct answer to a Simpsons news group on the night of the original broadcast. But this person had been using a college internet account that was no longer active by the time the contest ended, and the producers could not locate them. They issued an open invitation on the DVD release for this person to come forward. As far as anyone has confirmed, they never did. The show's creators had designed a mystery, publicly declared it was solvable from the clues presented in part one, promoted a national contest to test this, and the answer essentially nobody arrived at independently. That is a significant data point. Either the mystery was genuinely too difficult, or the clues didn't actually lead where the show claimed they led, or the answer was one that audiences rejected as illogical and therefore didn't pursue. Probably some combination of all three. Now look at the specific evidence. Burns fell on the sundial and his hands pointed to the letters W and S. From Burns' own perspective, lying on his back looking up, those letters read as M and S. The show presents this as pointing to Maggie Simpson, M for Maggie, S for Simpson, the central clue of the most promoted mystery in the show's history. But Burns himself, when asked about this in the episode, explicitly states that his hands fell on those letters by accident. He didn't deliberately point at them. He fell. The sundial clue, the dramatic visual that ended the summer cliffhanger, the image on every promotional poster, was described by the victim as a coincidence. The biggest piece of evidence in the case was admitted by the person it supposedly came from to be meaningless. Then there's the gun. Burns was carrying a weapon in a holster. Before the shooting, there's a moment where the holster is visible and empty. Burns's gun was already missing from his person before the attack occurred. Whoever shot Burns used his own weapon. This is a crucial distinction because it tells you something specific about the shooter. The person who fired that gun was not someone who came to the town meeting intending to commit violence. They didn't bring a weapon. They found Burns's gun by chance. They used it impulsively, or it discharged during a struggle, depending on which version of events you believe. A baby encountering a gun on the ground fits this profile, but so does a large portion of Springfield's population on that particular evening. The detail that the shooter used Burns's own gun actually broadens the suspect pool rather than narrowing it. Burns's last words before being shot were reportedly, "Oh, it's you." Not a cry of surprise, not a sound of fear, a recognition, a greeting for someone familiar. Burns said those words in a tone that suggests he recognized whoever had his gun pointed at him, that he was not threatened by their presence, that he saw them and identified them as someone he knew. Does Burns know Maggie Simpson? Had Burns Before this episode ever interacted with Maggie in any meaningful way, the show has not established a prior relationship between Burns and Maggie. Burns famously cannot identify or remember Homer, a man who has worked directly for him for years. The idea that Burns would respond to a 1-year-old child with relaxed recognition, "Oh, it's you," in a way that suggests familiarity while simultaneously being unable to remember the name of his own long-term employee, requires a significant logical leap. Season 18. Homer is in a conversation and claims, in what could easily be dismissed as a throwaway line, that he was the one who shot Burns. He says it plainly, on camera. Nobody reacts, nobody investigates, nobody reopens the case or files a motion to re-examine the evidence. Homer confesses to the attempted murder of the richest and most powerful man in Springfield, and the show treats it like something forgettable. This moment either means that Homer is lying for attention, which is consistent with his character in some contexts, or that he's telling the truth and the original verdict was wrong. And if Homer did it, if he finally snapped under the accumulated weight of years of disrespect and invisibility and pulled the trigger himself, then the DNA evidence makes perfect sense. The eyelash belonged to a Simpson because a Simpson was the shooter. Homer's fingerprints were on the gun because Homer held the gun. The evidence pointed at Homer, not because it was a red herring, but because Homer is the answer. The Marge theory deserves examination because it's constructed with unusual care. The argument runs as follows. Marge watched Burns systematically destroy her children's school, injure her family's dog, eliminate the retirement home where elderly members of her community lived, and block the sun from the town her family calls home. She had every reason to want Burns removed. And Burns, earlier in the series, had developed an infatuation with Marge during a period when she worked at the plant. He was drawn to her. He found her compelling. If Marge was the shooter, Burns's behavior after waking from the coma makes a particular kind of sense. He woke up, identified his attacker, looked at the woman he'd been drawn to for years, and chose not to name her. He pointed at the sundial instead. He let Maggie become the answer because Maggie was the safest possible answer. Burns protected Marge by creating a conclusion that the justice system couldn't act on. A baby cannot be prosecuted, as Chief Wiggum explicitly acknowledges. Maggie was the perfect solution, an accusation the law had no mechanism to pursue, accepted by a town that was tired of the whole thing and ready to move on. The show's own alternate ending production history supports the idea that Maggie wasn't the only viable answer the writers seriously considered. A complete alternate conclusion was animated and fully produced in which Smithers was the shooter. Full length, fully voiced, finished. This version was shown in the Simpsons 138th episode Spectacular and dismissed by Troy McClure with a line that directly references the O.J. Simpson trial. The Smithers ending, McClure's explains, wouldn't have made sense because all the DNA evidence would have had to be ignored, which would be downright nutty. That is not subtle. The show is winking directly at the audience. It is acknowledging that ignoring DNA evidence is something that happens, that juries have done it, that outcomes are shaped by more than just physical evidence, and that the official answer to a mystery isn't necessarily the true answer. The show used a reference to one of the most famous acquittals in American legal history to dismiss an alternate ending, while simultaneously making you think about all the reasons official conclusions are sometimes wrong. An early draft of the script also had Barney Gumble as the shooter. This was abandoned, but the fact that it was written and considered means the answer wasn't determined by the clues. The clues were adjusted to fit whatever answer the writers eventually chose. The mystery was reverse engineered. And if the mystery was reverse engineered, then there is no single correct answer that the evidence points to. There are multiple possible answers that the evidence was shaped to accommodate. The final shot of the episode is Maggie alone in the room. She checks her surroundings, confirms nobody is watching, and then moves her pacifier in a motion that mimics pulling a trigger. The show plays this as confirmation, but watch it again without the frame of Maggie's guilt already in place. What you see is a 1-year-old child making a gesture she witnessed an adult making. Babies imitate. It's the primary way they learn. Maggie watched someone fire a gun. She's reproducing the motion because that's what she saw. That's not a confession, that's a memory. The greatest mystery in the show's history has an official answer that the victim described as a coincidence. A shooter who the evidence pointed away from as often as toward a confession from an alternate suspect that the show never followed up on, and a final image that's been framed as definitive proof but reads just as naturally as something else entirely. The case was closed. In Springfield, as we'll discuss later, closing a case and solving a case are two very different things. Springfield is a town that has a long history of deciding that the convenient answer is close enough to the true answer and filing the paperwork accordingly. Section 4, The Simpson Children. What the show isn't saying about Bart, Lisa, and Maggie the Simpson children are the heart of the show. They always have been. Homer and Marge are the architecture, the parents whose relationship gives the family its structure and its emotional center. But Bart and Lisa and Maggie are the reason the show has maintained its specific emotional register for 3 decades. They're the reason it can make you laugh for 20 minutes and then hit you with something that sticks. But the show has spent 36 years showing you these three children in a way that's consistently more interesting than the surface reading suggests. Each of them is carrying something the show is only partially articulated. Each of them has a story that the format, with its episodic resets and floating timeline, can approach but never fully land. Understanding what the show is actually doing with these characters requires stepping back from the episode by episode view and looking at the cumulative portrait. Let's start with Bart. Bart Simpson arrived on American television as a specific kind of cultural provocation. He was the bad kid, the underachiever, the one who didn't care about school, didn't care about authority, didn't care about the expectations that adults placed on children in the Reagan to Bush era of American family values. Bart was an anti message in an era of programming that was deeply invested in messages. He didn't have a lesson at the end of each episode. He didn't learn and grow. He was, and the show was entirely honest about this, a 10-year-old boy who was smarter than most of the adults around him and bored out of his mind by what the world was offering him in exchange for compliance. The subversive energy of early Bart was real and it was earned. He wasn't rebellious in a shallow way. He was rebellious because Springfield, as a community, had essentially nothing to offer a child with his particular combination of intelligence, restlessness, and emotional sensitivity. And that last quality, the emotional sensitivity, is the one the show has done the most interesting work with while receiving the least credit for it. Bart cares. This is the thing that gets lost in the cultural shorthand of underachiever and proud of it. Bart cares deeply, consistently, and with a vulnerability that the show keeps mostly subterranean because Bart himself would be horrified to have it acknowledged. He cares about his friendships with a fierceness that the show has returned to repeatedly. He cares about animals. His bond with Santa's little helper is one of the show's most genuinely tender recurring threads. He cares about his family in a way he can only express through action rather than words, which is why the episodes where Bart helps someone in real need are consistently the show's most emotionally affecting. The relationship between Bart and his father is the show's most complex ongoing dynamic, and the show knows this even when it's not foregrounding it.
Homer strangles Bart.
This is a gag. It happens constantly. It's part of the visual vocabulary of the show. It's in the opening credits. And it's also, if you think about it for more than a moment, a depiction of a father physically attacking his son in response to minor provocations. The show frames this as comedy, and within the show's logic, it functions as comedy. The cumulative picture of Homer and Bart's relationship is one of a father who loves his son profoundly and expresses that love almost exclusively through embarrassment, confrontation, and the occasional violence of frustrated affection. The episodes where this relationship is examined directly are the ones where The Simpsons earns its reputation as something more than a cartoon. The season 3 episode Radio Bart, where Homer spends days trying to rescue his son from a well, contains some of the most genuinely felt father-son emotion the show has ever produced. The season 4 episode Like Father, Like Clown, which reverses the dynamic and has Bart and Lisa helping Krusty reconnect with his own father, works partly because Bart understands absent fathers in a way that runs deeper than comedy. His own father is present and absent simultaneously, physically there, emotionally limited by a combination of intellectual constraint and the specific wounds of his own upbringing. Bart has consistently demonstrated an intelligence that the show treats as a gag, but that, accumulated over hundreds of episodes, looks like something else. He is, in practical terms, one of the most effective social operators in Springfield. He understands systems of authority, identifies their weaknesses, and exploits those weaknesses with efficiency that his academic record completely fails to capture. The gap between Bart's institutional performance and his actual capability is enormous, and the show has occasionally acknowledged this directly while usually backing away from the implications. The most devastating version of the Bart story isn't the one the show tells about him failing school. It's the one it tells about what happens to someone with Bart's specific combination of abilities in an environment that has no mechanism for recognizing them. Springfield's educational system has one mode. It rewards the kind of intelligence that Lisa has, the kind that expresses itself through grades, through tests, through verbal articulation of learned knowledge. Bart's intelligence doesn't operate that way. It's situational, adaptive, relational, and largely invisible to any measurement tool the school possesses. So Bart is categorized as a failure in an institution that isn't built to identify what he actually is. And under the radiation theory, Bart's situation takes on an additional layer. If Springfield's environment has genuinely altered the cognitive development of its residents, the question of how it's affected Bart specifically is one the show has never directly addressed. Homer's exposure produced catastrophic reduction in measurable intelligence. What if Bart's exposure produced something different? Not reduction, but distortion? A kind of cognitive asymmetry where certain capacities are amplified while others are suppressed, creating a profile that looks like failure to conventional measurement, but represents something more complicated? The show has never committed to this reading, but it's built enough material to support it that the reading doesn't require you to import anything from outside the text. Now, Lisa Simpson is the most structurally lonely character in the history of American animation. This is not an exaggeration. The show has been building her isolation with extraordinary consistency for 3 decades. And what makes it remarkable is that the isolation isn't the result of her being unlikable or difficult or genuinely alienating. Lisa is lonely because she is surrounded by a community that is constitutionally unable to engage with what she actually is. She is, within the show's universe, a genius. Her IQ has been measured, her abilities have been demonstrated, her intellectual gifts have been validated repeatedly by external sources throughout the series. She plays the saxophone with the kind of feeling that goes beyond technical proficiency. She reads voraciously and retains everything. She makes connections that no other character in Springfield is capable of making. She sees patterns, she sees systems, she sees, with uncomfortable clarity, the gap between how Springfield describes itself and how it actually operates. And none of this has made her happy. The show is honest about this in a way that animated series rarely are. Lisa's intelligence isn't her superpower, it's her defining source of suffering. Because intelligence in Springfield is not useful the way it would be useful in an environment that valued it. Intelligence in Springfield is a form of visibility that draws the wrong kind of attention mockery, dismissal, the specific hostility that communities sometimes direct at members who refuse to share the communal blindness. The relationship between Lisa and her father is the emotional core of the show. Not Homer and Marge's marriage, though that's been the subject of more dramatic attention. The father daughter relationship. Because Homer and Lisa are the most incompatible people in the family. She is everything he isn't, intellectually, temperamentally, morally, and yet they love each other with a completeness that the show has earned by showing you their incompatibility first and their connection second. The episode Do It For Her, often cited as one of the greatest half hours of television ever produced, makes this explicit in a way that requires no interpretation. Homer hangs a note on the refrigerator at the end that reads, next to a photo of Maggie, do it for her. He works a job he hates in a facility that is actively harming him for a man who cannot remember his name because the alternative is failing his children. And the show doesn't frame this as noble self sacrifice in a triumphant way. It frames it as the quite tragedy of a man who has accepted a diminished life because the people inside that life are worth the diminishment. Lisa sees this. She sees it more clearly than any other member of the family. And the specific anguish of her position is that she can see it and cannot change it and cannot stop caring that she can't change it. She is 8 years old and she understands the architecture of her family's suffering with a precision that her father will never be capable of. And that understanding is not a comfort, it's an additional weight. The show has given Lisa several storylines that examine what her future might look like flash forwards, alternate timelines, dream sequences. They're consistently melancholy. The versions of adult Lisa that the show has depicted are accomplished, thoughtful, principled, and alone. She's achieved what she was working toward. The achievement didn't fix the loneliness. The show is quietly honest about the limits of intelligence as a solution to the problem of belonging. Under the radiation theory, Lisa represents an interesting complication. If Springfield's contaminated environment diminishes cognitive function in most of its residents, why does Lisa display extraordinary intelligence? One reading is that she's simply the genetic outlier, the statistical exception that any population produces. Another, more unsettling reading is that her intelligence isn't functioning the way she experiences it. That what Lisa perceives as clarity is actually a symptom, that her ability to see Springfield systems clearly is itself a product of the contamination, a specific kind of cognitive alteration that amplifies analytical capacity while severing the emotional circuits that would allow her to act on what she analyzes. Lisa can see everything wrong with Springfield. She cannot fix any of it. She keeps trying anyway. This pattern never breaks. And the radiation theory offers one explanation for why the pattern never breaks. Because her ability to act is as compromised as her ability to see is enhanced. She's been given the diagnosis capacity without the treatment capacity. She can identify the illness in precise detail, but the same environment that gave her that ability also made sure she'd never have the tools to address it. Now, Maggie. Everything about Maggie Simpson should be unremarkable. She's 1 year old. She's been 1 year old for 36 years. She doesn't talk in any meaningful way. She doesn't walk reliably. She communicates through the sounds made around a pacifier and through an expressiveness in her face that the show deploys with more precision than you'd expect, given that it belongs to a character who is ostensibly a background presence. Mackie is not a background presence. She never has been. The show has spent 3 decades loading a character who makes almost no noise with more documented capability than almost anyone else in Springfield. Start with what she's done. She shot a billionaire. She organized and led a daycare rebellion against a tyrannical caretaker. She has saved her family from immediate physical danger on multiple occasions in ways that required genuine situational awareness and rapid decision making. She has demonstrated problem solving capability in situations where adult characters failed. She has been tested and found to register intelligence that standardized instruments struggle to measure accurately because the upper range of their scales wasn't designed to account for whatever Maggie is. The theatrical short The Longest Daycare, which ran before screenings of Ice Age, Continental Drift in 2012 and received an Academy Award nomination, is the clearest direct statement the show has made about Maggie's actual nature. It's 7 minutes, no dialogue. Maggie is left at a daycare center where an authoritarian caretaker runs the facility with institutional efficiency. Maggie encounters a caterpillar that is about to become a butterfly. Another child, a bully, wants to destroy it. What follows is Maggie conducting what is essentially a tactical operation. She reads the environment systematically. She identifies every threat. She assesses multiple possible approaches and selects the most efficient one. She executes a plan that involves understanding physical systems, predicting other people's behavior, managing her own exposure, and adapting in real time when circumstances change. She does all of this in a facility specifically designed to constrain children's movement and monitor their behavior. And she succeeds and releases the butterfly, and the whole thing is wordless and extraordinary. The gap between what Maggie's body can do, she falls over constantly. She crawls more than she walks. Her motor control is still developing. And what her mind is clearly doing is one of the most consistent details in the show's background texture. Her body is a 1 year old's body. Her decision making is something else entirely. The theory about why Maggie is silent is the one that rewards the most attention. The simple answer is that she's a baby, and babies don't talk. But Maggie has been 1 year old for 36 years, and in that time, she has produced exactly one confirmed word Daddy, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor, which happened once and was never repeated. The show hasn't depicted Maggie developing language the way it's depicted other aspects of her growth and change. She remains, deliberately and consistently, without speech. The theory argues this is strategic. Look at the household Maggie exists inside. It's loud. Homer is loud. Marge expresses worry verbally and constantly. Bart is perpetually provoking something. Lisa is perpetually explaining something. The Simpson household is a wall of ongoing verbal noise. Maggie sits in the middle of it and watches. And watch what Maggie has watched. She watched Lisa, the most intelligent member of the family, clearly, demonstrably, measurably, spend her entire childhood fighting for recognition and receiving dismissal. Lisa speaks up and gets ignored. Lisa challenges and gets punished. Lisa's intelligence is the thing that most consistently isolates her from the people she most wants to connect with. This from infancy, from the very beginning, Maggie has watched what happens to the smart girl who announces herself in this house, and she made a different calculation. If intelligence expressed visibly brings nothing but trouble, Then the optimal strategy is to contain the expression while retaining the capability. Silence is not absence. Silence is presence without exposure. The less you appear to know, the less they expect from you, the more freedom you actually have to operate. Every remarkable thing Maggie has done, she has done in spaces where nobody was paying close attention. The shooting of Burns happened in a parking lot after the main event. The daycare rebellion happened in a building that adults weren't monitoring carefully. Her heroic interventions in the family's various crises happened at moments when everyone else was occupied with the immediate chaos. Maggie works in the margins. She works below the threshold of notice. And she has ensured that threshold is very low by maintaining meticulously the appearance of an ordinary baby. She checks her surroundings before performing a gesture that would reveal her understanding. She never speaks in front of witnesses. She reserves her competence for situations where it will be effective and unobserved. These are not infant behaviors. They are the behaviors of someone who has assessed their environment, identified its power structures, and developed a specific methodology for operating within it without triggering its defensive mechanisms. The Maggie story is the one The Simpsons has been building with the most patience and the most care because it's the one it can never actually tell. Telling it would require Maggie to do something undeniable, something so visible that the family in the town could no longer maintain the fiction of her as simply a baby. And once that fiction falls, once Springfield has to acknowledge what Maggie actually is, the entire equilibrium of the show changes. Maggie is the character who could break the loop. She's the only one who both understands what Springfield is and hasn't been completely compromised by it. Homer can't see it clearly enough. Lisa can see it but can't act. Bart can act but doesn't see the full picture. Maggie sees it and acts and keeps the results to herself and has been doing this for 36 years. What she's waiting for, what she's building toward, the show has never said. And that silence, both hers and the show's, is the most interesting unsolved mystery the series contains. Expansion content to be inserted into full script section 1 expansion after it all traces back to the same cracked cooling tower. Let's go deeper into the contamination evidence because what we've covered so far is only the most visible layer. Consider what the show tells us about Springfield's waterways specifically. The river near the plant, sometimes called the Springfield River, sometimes the Shelbyville River in episodes where the town's geography shifts, appears in enough episodes to build a meaningful picture of its condition. Beyond Blinky, the three-eyed fish, the show has depicted this body of water as a site of ongoing industrial runoff. The power plant's waste management, as depicted in the inspection episode, involves the direct transfer of radioactive material into the waterways at a rate and volume that was described in the inspection itself as one of the facility's most severe documented violations. The inspectors noted it. Burns noted their noting. The violations continued. What does long-term radioactive contamination of a primary water source do to a population that has been drinking from it for decades? The scientific literature on this question exists in the real world and makes for uncomfortable reading even when the contamination levels are far below what The Simpsons depicts. The show's contamination, radioactive waste dumped directly into residential water supplies, not as a single incident but as an ongoing long-term policy, would, if applied to a real population, produce effects on neurological development, reproductive biology, endocrine function, and immune response that would be detectable across the entire community within a single generation. The first generation of Springfield residents to drink the contaminated water might show subtle effects. The second generation, raised on the same water from birth, would show more pronounced ones. The third generation, and Springfield has now been running for long enough to have a plausible third generation in its timeline, would be, depending on the concentrations involved, significantly altered. The Simpson children are, within the show's timeline, at minimum second generation contamination subjects. Homer and Marge were both exposed before their children were born. Homer worked directly in the facility, in proximity to the reactor, for the entirety of his adult working life before any of the children arrived. Marge worked there as well for a period. The three children were conceived in an environment that had already been compromised for years and grew up drinking the same compromised water that had been accumulating radioactive runoff for decades before their births. The show also gives us the Springfield Elementary water fountains, depicted in multiple episodes as producing liquid of a distinctly unsettling character. In at least one episode, the water from a school fountain is visibly discolored. In another, drinking from the fountain produces an immediate and visible physical reaction in a student. The show plays these as gags, but the school is supplied by the same municipal water system as the rest of Springfield. If the plant is contaminating the residential water supply, it is also contaminating the water that Springfield's children drink every day at school. Skinner is aware of this, or should be. The principal of a school that is downstream from a nuclear facility with active contamination violations, in the real world, this would be a mandatory reporting situation. Principals are required by law, in most jurisdictions, to report known environmental hazards affecting the children in their care. Skinner has never reported anything. He has never publicly raised concerns about the water fountains or the air quality near the plant or the elevated incidence of physical anomalies in the student population. Whether this is because Skinner or Tamzarian is part of Springfield's institutional structure of denial, or because Burns's influence extends into the school's administrative framework, or simply because the same contamination that affects everyone else in Springfield has also affected Skinner's capacity to recognize and respond to the hazard. The result is the same. The school is a closed system. The children inside it are not protected, and the adult responsible for their institutional safety either cannot see the problem or has decided not to. The Springfield Hospital deserves attention here as well. Dr. Julius Hibbert, the Simpson family's primary physician, is one of the more consistently depicted medical professionals in the show's history. He has treated every member of the Simpson family for a wide range of conditions over the show's run, and his general competence is actually depicted as above the Springfield average. He's shown as genuinely skilled within the show's comic register, even when the jokes require him to deliver terrible news in bizarrely inappropriate ways. But Hibbert has never, across 3 decades of treating patients in Springfield, connected the pattern of physical anomalies he must be seeing in his patient population to the obvious environmental cause. He has treated Homer's injuries, including injuries sustained during nuclear incidents at the plant. He has treated Bart and Lisa for various conditions that accumulated should raise questions about the health of children raised in their specific environment. He has access to the same three-eyed fish story that the rest of the town had access to, and he has never, in any episode, raised the connection between Burns's facility and the health outcomes he's observing in his practice. This either means Hibbert is operating within the same cognitive limitations as the rest of Springfield's population, or it means his practice is in some way connected to the structure that Burns has built around the town's compliance. Burns funds private medical research. Burns has personal physicians. Burns maintains relationships with healthcare infrastructure throughout Springfield. The possibility that Burns's influence extends into the professional conduct of the town's doctors, ensuring that certain questions don't get asked, certain patterns don't get documented, certain reports don't get filed, is exactly the kind of institutional corruption that the show has otherwise depicted Burns engaging in without hesitation. The crayon story again, from this angle. A doctor discovered a foreign object lodged in a child's brain and said nothing. That doctor was operating in a Springfield medical context that was already shaped by Burns's influence. And the decision not to remove the crayon, whether made for reasons of professional convenience or deliberate suppression, produced a version of Homer Simpson who could work at a nuclear power plant indefinitely without recognizing that the plant was destroying the community around him. The medical establishment of Springfield is not a neutral institution. Nothing in Springfield is neutral. Every institution, the school, the police, the government, the hospital, the church, operates within a web of relationships that Burns has over more than a century, woven to ensure that the town's systems consistently produce outcomes that preserve his position. The contamination is not the only product of the plant. The institutional incapacity to address the contamination is also a product of the plant, engineered with the same care and maintained with these same resources. This is the full scope of the conspiracy that the radiation theory describes. Not just a leaking reactor surrounded by the deliberate degradation of every mechanism that might otherwise detect and respond to the leak. Burns hasn't just poisoned Springfield's water. He's poisoned Springfield's capacity to know that its water is poisoned. Let's talk about what the show tells us about the fish in more detail, because Blinky is simultaneously one of the show's most obvious pieces of environmental commentary and one of its most completely ignored ones. A three-eyed fish is not a subtle mutation. It is not a small variation in color or scale pattern that could be attributed to natural genetic diversity. It is the addition of an entirely new sensory organ to a vertebrate body plan that, in its unaltered form, has been stable for hundreds of millions of years. The fish has grown a third eye. This represents a mutation significant enough that, if observed in a real river near a real nuclear facility, would trigger immediate federal investigation, mandatory remediation orders, and significant criminal liability for the facility's operators. In the episode, it does trigger some version of this response. It becomes national news, it's used as campaign evidence. Burns is forced to eat the fish on television. These are scaled down versions of the real world regulatory responses that would apply. But the response doesn't stick, the news cycle moves on, the investigation doesn't continue, the river is not tested, the facility is not required to remediate, and in subsequent seasons, Blinky becomes a recurring cameo. The fish appears in other episodes, still three eyed, still living in the contaminated river near the plant, treated as a bit of nostalgia or a quick visual callback, rather than as evidence of an ongoing environmental emergency. The show keeps showing you the mutation and keeps expecting you to find it charming rather than alarming, which is precisely the same cognitive adjustment Springfield's residents have made and precisely the adjustment the show is documenting by depicting it. The mutation story doesn't end with fish. There are multiple episodes in which Springfield's local wildlife demonstrates anomalies that go beyond what normal variation can explain. Animals in the areas immediately surrounding the plant show physical characteristics that are not consistent with their species' baseline biology. Background flora in scenes near the reactor sometimes shows visual abnormalities. The show doesn't make these details the focus of any specific episode. They're part of the environmental texture, part of what Springfield looks like when you're inside it. But they accumulate. The picture they form, if you're tracking it across dozens of episodes, is of an ecosystem in sustained deterioration that nobody in Springfield has been able to fully perceive because the deterioration has been happening since before most of them were born and has become to them simply what normal looks like. The show has one of the most consistent commitments to depicting environmental damage in the history of American television. It has been showing you for 36 years exactly what a corporation's refusal to manage its environmental impact looks like when the corporation in question has also successfully captured every institution that might otherwise hold it accountable. The contamination of Springfield is not a background gag. It is the show's central long form argument. Every other mystery we discuss is ultimately downstream from this one. Section 2 expansion. The coma theory, deeper evidence. The coma theory gains significant additional texture when you look at the specific ways that shows dreamlike qualities manifest in narrative structure rather than just premise. Dreams have a distinctive relationship with consequence. Things happen in dreams and are forgotten. Situations are established and then abandoned. Characters appear and then vanish. The internal logic of a dream holds together within any given sequence, but does not maintain consistency across the whole. If you try to reconstruct the spatial or temporal geography of a dream after waking, the map keeps contradicting itself. Rooms connect to rooms they shouldn't connect to. Timelines overlap. The same event seems to have happened both before and after another event it couldn't logically precede. The Simpsons, by any honest assessment, has this relationship with its own narrative across its full run. The continuity of the show is famously inconsistent. Characters remember things they were shown to have forgotten. Events that should have permanent consequences are treated as if they never happened. Relationships that were established in one episode are contradicted in a later one without explanation. The show's internal history is not a stable record. It's a fluid resource that gets drawn on as each episode requires and abandoned when the episode ends. For most long running shows, this kind of continuity inconsistency is explained by the practical realities of production, different writers, different seasons, different showrunners, an inability to maintain consistent tracking of 36 years of narrative detail. And this explanation is real and valid and accounts for much of the inconsistency. But the coma theory offers a reading in which the inconsistency itself is meaningful. Dreams don't have consistent continuity because the dreaming mind isn't maintaining an archive. It's generating. Each dream sequence uses the available material and produces something that is internally coherent in the moment without necessarily being consistent with other sequences produced from the same material. Homer's dreaming brain generates Springfield anew each episode from the same raw material, same people, the same locations, the same relationships, but without the continuous memory that would be required to maintain perfect consistency. The things Homer's dream gets wrong about itself are the places where his unconscious generation of this simulation ran out of accurate reference, material, and improvised. The relationships that contradict earlier relationships are the places where his brain had two possible versions of how those people interacted and used whichever one fit the current generation. The events that are forgotten between episodes are the places where Homer's brain lacked the capacity to maintain continuity across the gaps between simulation cycles. Under this reading, the show's continuity errors are not production failures. They're evidence. They're the map of Homer's dreaming brain's limitations, made visible through the structure of the narrative. The show has also, intermittently, depicted Homer's relationship with his own memory in ways that support this reading. Homer forgets things, not occasionally, not as a joke about aging or distraction, but systematically and comprehensively. He forgets events that happened in previous episodes. He forgets commitments he made. He forgets information he was given. He exists to a degree that goes beyond normal human absent-mindedness in a perpetual present. Each moment is relatively vivid for Homer. The moments before the current one are often inaccessible. This is clinically consistent with certain kinds of coma-related neurological damage. Specific injuries to the hippocampus and adjacent memory structures produce exactly this pattern: relative preservation of immediate present awareness combined with significant degradation of recent and medium-term memory. The person is awake and functional in the moment, but the integration of current experience into accessible long-term memory is severely impaired. They are permanently new to themselves. Homer's forgetfulness, played as comedy across 36 seasons, maps onto this specific neurological profile with an accuracy that would be unremarkable if Homer were a real person and his forgetfulness were being taken seriously as a symptom rather than a character trait. The Homer coma theory was originally articulated in detail by a Reddit user, and it has been circulating in Simpsons fandom for more than a decade. But what makes it more than just an interesting fan construct is the way it was anticipated by the show itself. Not in the fake waking up scene from season 34, which was clearly a deliberate engagement with the theory, but earlier, in the specific ways the show structured its narrative deterioration after season 4. In the particular dreamlike quality that the show's post-season 4 storytelling has, the increasing abstraction, the decreasing concern with realistic consequence, the progressive uncoupling from the social and economic realities that grounded the early seasons. The show didn't start making these moves randomly in response to audience pressure or creative exhaustion. The moves followed a specific pattern, exactly the pattern you'd expect from a show about someone's dream as the dream deteriorates over time. The deterioration isn't uniform. It progresses. It accelerates in certain periods and steadies in others, the way neurological decline in coma patients progresses. The show, at its best post season 4, is still remarkable television. But it is television that has departed from a particular kind of grounded realism, and that departure has never been satisfactorily explained by any account that doesn't at least partially acknowledge the coma theory's framework. The writers know the show changed after season 4. They've discussed it. Aljan, in various interviews about the show's creative evolution, has described the shift from domestic to more fantastic storylines as a deliberate creative choice. The writers wanted to expand Homer's world to give him more adventures, to avoid the limitation of stories set exclusively within the domestic context of work and family. This explanation is honest and probably reflects real creative decisions that were made at the time. But it also happens to be exactly what you'd say if you were a dreaming brain, rationalizing its own increasing disconnection from the reality it was trying to simulate. The dream wants more. The dream expands. The dream sends Homer to space because the hospital room television was showing news about NASA. The dream brings celebrities into Springfield because the hospital room television plays celebrity news in the background. The dream gets more elaborate and less realistic because the brain generating it is working with fewer and fewer intact reference points and filling the gaps with whatever ambient material is available. Al John says the show chose to expand Homer's world. The coma theory says the dream chose to expand Homer's world, and the production team made decisions that happened to align with what a deteriorating coma dream would do. Both can be true. They're not mutually exclusive. One final piece of evidence deserves attention here. The episode structure of The Simpsons has, across its run, been built around something that fans sometimes call the reset button. Each episode ends with the status quo restored. Whatever happened in the episode, however dramatic, however apparently permanent, is set aside by the episode's end, and the next episode begins with everything back to baseline. Bart doesn't stay injured from last week's adventure. Homer doesn't stay employed at the job he took in last week's episode. The consequences of Springfield's various catastrophes don't accumulate. This is standard episodic television structure, and it's employed across the genre. But The Simpsons has been unusually committed to it for an unusually long time, and the consistency of the reset is itself worth noting. In a dream, the reset is not a narrative device, it is the structure. Dreams reset because the brain cycles through sleep stages and the dreaming process restarts. Each time Homer's dream resets, it's the brain returning to the generation process. Each episode is a new cycle. The reset isn't lazy writing, it's the architecture of what's actually happening.
Section 3 expansion.
The Burns shooting, deeper physical evidence, the forensic evidence in the Who Shot Burns case has been examined by fans with genuine care, and the closer the examination, the more the official resolution struggles. Start with the physics of the incident as described. Burns was shot with his own gun in a parking lot. The gun had already left his holster before the shooting. Someone encountered the gun, either by finding it on the ground or by taking it from Burns, during some form of physical interaction. The gun then discharged and struck Burns. Maggie's version of events, as reported by Burns, is that Burns attempted to take her lollipop. His gun fell from his holster during the struggle, and Maggie picked it up. The gun then went off. This is presented as an accident. Burns didn't claim Maggie intentionally shot him. He described a gun going off in a baby's hands after falling from a holster. There are immediate practical questions. A professional grade handgun, the type Burns would carry, does not discharge when it is picked up by an infant. Modern firearms have multiple safety mechanisms specifically designed to prevent accidental discharge. A gun falling from a holster and being picked up by a small child would not, under any normal circumstances, discharge without some specific action being taken to disengage safeties and apply pressure to the trigger. The shot that hit Burns was not a randomly discharged accidental firing. Someone pulled that trigger. Whether that someone was Maggie or not is a separate question. The final shot of the episode, with Maggie mimicking the trigger pull gesture when alone, is the show's evidence that Maggie understood what she did. But for a 1-year-old child to have pulled the trigger on a professional quality handgun, the child would have needed the physical dexterity to disengage a safety mechanism and apply the trigger pull weight, which on most handguns of this type is measured in pounds of force, with the grip strength available to an infant. Infant grip strength is actually quite significant. Proportionally, babies have relatively strong grasps, but the mechanical requirements of intentionally discharging a professional firearm remain significant. The most plausible version of events in which Maggie did pull the trigger would involve a gun that was already safety disengaged, already in a position where minimal trigger pressure would discharge it, which means someone else had already prepared the gun for use before Maggie encountered it. If someone else had the gun before Maggie, if the gun was already prepared to fire when it came into Maggie's vicinity, then the chain of events becomes considerably more complicated than Burns's simple account suggests. The possibility that someone else handled the gun, that someone else set up the conditions under which Maggie's encounter with the weapon produced a shot introduces a potential additional actor into the incident that the official investigation never pursued. Who had access to Burns's holster? Who was near enough to Burns during the town meeting to have relieved him of the weapon before he left the building? The investigation focused on who could have been in the parking lot when the shot was fired. It didn't adequately examine who might have interfered with the weapon while Burns was still inside, potentially setting up an incident that would only appear accidental when a convenient nearby figure, a baby, encountered the already primed weapon. This reading doesn't require Maggie to be innocent. She may have pulled the trigger. The question is whether she was the original agent of the shooting or whether she was the last link in a chain that began elsewhere with someone who understood exactly how to create an incident that would be attributed to the most legally untouchable person at the scene. Homer's season 18 confession also warrants a closer reading than it typically receives. In the context of the episode in which it occurs, Homer's statement that he shot Burns appears to be the kind of offhand remark that gets dismissed as Homer seeking attention or misremembering. But Homer doesn't typically confess to violent crimes even in his most confused states. His confessions throughout the series tend to be to petty failures, eating food he wasn't supposed to, forgetting commitments, causing minor accidents. Confessing to shooting his employer is a different category of statement. If Homer did shoot Burns, the physical evidence can still be accounted for. The eyelash on Burns's suit belonged to a Simpson. Homer is a Simpson. Homer's fingerprints on the gun are explained by Homer having held the gun. The DNA pointed to Homer, and Homer in season 18 says it was Homer. The official verdict of Maggie's guilt required Burns to wake from a coma and identify his shooter, and Burns waking from a coma with a clear and accurate recollection of a traumatic event is not the most reliable evidentiary foundation available. Coma recovery is frequently accompanied by confabulation, the brain filling gaps in its actual memory with plausible seeming reconstructions that feel like genuine memories. Burns woke up and says it was Maggie, but Burns had also been unconscious for an extended period, during which his brain was doing the kind of gap filling work that all recovering coma patients do. His identification of Maggie as the shooter, made immediately upon waking, is the recollection of a man whose brain had been reconstructing his own narrative during his unconscious period. The reconstruction may have been accurate. It also may have been the most plausible story Burns's brain could assemble from the available fragments, which would produce a confident seeming identification that felt completely real to the person generating it, and was nonetheless wrong. The investigation accepted Burns's identification without serious scrutiny because it was the most legally convenient conclusion available. A baby cannot be prosecuted. Nobody wanted to continue pursuing the case with the effort it would require to reach a different verdict against a different suspect. Springfield was tired of the summer's drama. The town wanted to go back to normal. Burns said Maggie. Wiggum closed the file, and normal resumed. It is entirely possible that Homer Simpson committed an attempted murder, and his baby daughter has been living under the attribution for it for 3 decades. It is entirely possible that Burns, the victim, chose to name the one person present who could never face consequences because he was protecting someone else, Marge or himself, or the structural stability of Springfield. And it is entirely possible that the one person who knows exactly what happened is the person who cannot be asked in any episode to tell us, because the show has been very careful to ensure that Maggie's silence on this subject is maintained at all costs. Section 4 expansion, Lisa's intelligence and what it cost her. The loneliness of Lisa Simpson is one of the show's most sustained and specific creative commitments, and it deserves more time than the section above gave it. Lisa's IQ has been tested in multiple episodes, and the results, while inconsistent in their specific numbers, have been consistently very high. More importantly, the show has not used Lisa's intelligence as a simple marker of superiority or as a comic contrast to Homer's limited capability. It has used Lisa's intelligence to document, episode after episode, what it costs to be the person in the room who sees most clearly in an environment that hasn't been designed with that kind of clarity in mind. The specific loneliness of being very smart in a community that doesn't share your intellectual register is not the loneliness of rejection. It is the loneliness of proximity without connection. Lisa is surrounded by people. She has a family that loves her and a teacher who has occasional moments of genuine engagement and classmates who tolerate her presence. She is not alone in the physical sense. She is alone in the sense of having no one to. No one for whom the conversations she wants to have are the conversations they want to have. Every interaction involves a form of code switching, a translation from the register she naturally operates in to one that the other person can access, and this constant translation is exhausting in a way that people who don't experience it often underestimate. The show has done this particularly well in episodes that pair Lisa with characters who are temporarily or situationally operating at her level. The substitute teacher Richard, voiced in season 2 by Dustin Hoffman, was one such character, and the episode around him is one of the show's most emotionally honest precisely because it shows what it does to Lisa to find someone who can meet her where she is. She falls in love in the way an 8-year-old understands falling in love, because the feeling of being genuinely seen and engaged at your actual level of intelligence is so rare and so nourishing that it produces something resembling devotion. And then he leaves, as temporary connections in Springfield always do, and Lisa goes back to the couch and the silence and the saxophone. The saxophone is important. Lisa's jazz playing is not the show depicting a child prodigy for narrative convenience. It's the show giving Lisa a language that operates outside the social register of Springfield. Music, as the show uses it for Lisa, is the place she can communicate without being constrained by who is and isn't able to receive what she's communicating. When Lisa plays, The emotional content she's expressing bypasses the social barriers that her verbal intelligence constantly encounters. The saxophone is not a talent. It's a survival mechanism. The show has been careful to ensure that Lisa's musical ability is specifically jazz and specifically saxophone, not classical piano, not guitar, but the instrument and the form most associated with improvisation and with the expression of emotional experience that doesn't fit standard social articulation. Jazz is a form built around responding honestly to the moment you're actually in, without the safety net of a predetermined structure. Lisa plays jazz because jazz is the only language in Springfield she can speak in her own voice without having to translate. Under the radiation theory, there's a specific reading of Lisa's intelligence that's worth pursuing. If the contamination affects neurological development differently in different individuals, as any environmental exposure produces differential effects across a population, Lisa's specific cognitive profile might be not a random genetic gift, but a product of the same exposure that damaged Homer. Homer's intelligence was reduced. Lisa's was amplified in a specific register: analytical, pattern recognizing, verbally precise, while her social emotional integration shows exactly the deficits you'd expect from someone whose intelligence developed under conditions of stress and alteration. Lisa's social difficulties are not simply explained by being smarter than everyone around her. Plenty of highly intelligent people navigate social environments with reasonable success. Lisa's difficulties are specific. She cannot consistently read social cues correctly. She misses registers of irony and casual interaction that don't operate at the level she's tracking. She gets the words right and misses the tone. This profile is consistent with a particular kind of cognitive asymmetry: high verbal analytical, lower social processing that environmental factors can produce in ways that pure genetic intelligence variation doesn't typically generate. Lisa might be the specific shape of what the contamination produces when it amplifies rather than degrades. Homer is what happens when the radiation damages the analytical centers while leaving the social emotional circuitry relatively intact. Hence, Homer S low IQ, combined with his genuine warmth and his functional ability to navigate social situations within Springfield's norms. Lisa is what happens when the radiation amplifies the analytical centers at the expense of the social processing circuitry. Hence her extraordinary intellectual capability combined with her persistent social difficulty. Same environmental cause, different cellular targets. Two very different people, related by blood and environment, each carrying the specific shape of their family's contamination. Section 9 expansion. Principal Skinner in depth the Tamsarian revelation deserves more time than it initially received because the implications extend beyond the episode itself into the show's entire relationship with identity and the performance of the self. Armin Tamsarian spent 20 years becoming someone he was not. More precisely, he spent 20 years becoming the version of Seymour Skinner that Agnes and Springfield needed him to be, and in the process, he actually became that person in every way that the community could verify. He ran the school, he managed the teachers, he disciplined Bart Simpson, which is practically a full time occupation on its own. He maintained a relationship with Agnes that was, within its functional parameters, genuinely caring. He participated in the community as a full member. He attended town meetings and civic events and did the small, mundane things that constitute membership in a place. The real Seymour Skinner showed up, and the town was forced to choose between the person who had been their principal for 20 years, who had actually done the job, built the relationships, woven himself into the institutional fabric of Springfield Elementary, and the person who had the legal and biographical claim to the identity being performed. They chose the performance. This is disturbing on one level. On another level, it's an honest acknowledgement of how identity actually works in communities. Identity is relational. It exists in the web of recognition and expectation and history that a community builds around a person. Tamsarian had that web. The real Skinner had only the biographical facts that would, in a different context, entitle him to it. The town looked at 20 years of daily reality versus a set of historical claims, and the 20 years won. What makes the episode disturbing isn't that the town chose the wrong thing in some absolute moral sense. It's that they chose so easily. They didn't agonize, they didn't split on the question. The vote was unanimous. Springfield knew almost immediately that maintaining the established fiction was preferable to engaging with the disruption that the truth would require, and they formalized that preference through legal decree and enforced it through exile. The real Skinner's exile is the episode's most genuinely unsettling image. He is literally tied to a railroad car. He is physically expelled from the community that his identity was taken from. He came back with proof that the official narrative was wrong, and the community's response was to remove him from the community and prohibit his return. Truth is not welcomed in Springfield. It is processed, assessed for its cost, and if the cost exceeds the acceptable threshold, it is expelled with whatever force is available. Springfield's institutional memory is selective, not because its residents are passive or unintelligent, but because selectivity is a survival strategy in an environment where too many truths are too costly to acknowledge. The town has three-eyed fish in its river, a billionaire who runs weekly radiation treatments to stay alive, a baby who shot a man without consequence, an unsafe nuclear plant that employs most of the town, a principal who is not who he says he is, and decades of accumulated catastrophe that keep getting forgotten by the following episode. Every one of these truths, if genuinely engaged with, would require the town to take actions that would destabilize the structures it depends on to function so the town doesn't exige. It classifies, useful truths get acknowledged, costly truths get locked up or exiled, and the community maintains the stability that the classification system provides at the cost of the accuracy that only honest engagement with difficult information can generate. The Skinner episode shows you the classification machine running. That's why it feels like a betrayal of the show's values. The show's values, at their best, involve looking clearly at difficult things. The Skinner episode shows Springfield looking clearly at a difficult thing and then deliberately looking away. Because the audience found this uncomfortable because the show was doing what Springfield does rather than what the show is supposed to do. It was operating from inside the denial rather than examining the denial from outside. But that's also what makes it the most honest episode in the series. Because the show is part of Springfield. The show is produced by people operating within the same institutional pressures that operate on every other Springfield institution. The denial is in the show's structure, not just in its subject. The Skinner episode was the one time the show acknowledged this directly, showed you the machine that runs in the background of every other episode, the machine that produces the resets and the forgetting and the comfortable lies. And it did this with enough discomfort and enough self awareness that 30 years of fan response have been, in effect, the audience trying to process what they saw. They didn't like what they saw because what they saw was themselves. Section 10 expansion. The floating timeline's deepest implications, the most honest thing that can be said about the floating timeline is this: it is a transaction, not a production convenience, not a failure of imagination. A transaction between the show and its audience, negotiated in public across 36 years. The audience needed The Simpsons to stay who they were. The show needed the audience to keep watching. Both sides of this transaction are served by the floating timeline. The audience gets to go home to Evergreen Terrace and find it unchanged whenever they need that. The show gets to continue as long as the audience keeps making that choice. But transactions have costs, and the cost of this one is rarely examined directly. The floating timeline doesn't just freeze the Simpsons family. It freezes the show's relationship to the subject matter it initially engaged with most powerfully. The early Simpsons was devastating on the subject of working class American life, the economic anxiety, the educational system's failures, the way institutional power operates in the daily lives of people with no leverage over the institutions they depend on. These subjects haven't gone away. The conditions the early show described have, in many ways, intensified since 1989. A working class American family with The Simpsons' economic profile in 2025 faces pressures that the early show's Springfield was just beginning to articulate. But because the timeline floats, because the characters never age, and their circumstances never meaningfully progress, the show cannot fully engage with what has happened to working class America over the 36 years it has been documenting working class America. It can make current jokes with current references. It cannot make the argument that the early show made about what it means to be Homer Simpson, specifically in a specific economic moment, because making that argument with the specificity it requires would require the show to admit that time has passed, that the economic moment has changed, that the Homer of 2025 is in a materially different situation from the Homer of 1989, even if the same actor is playing him in the same house. The floating timeline protects the show from this reckoning. It keeps Homer and Marge in a generic present that can be any present, which means it can also be no specific present. The satire can remain broad because the specificity that would make it sharp would also require the show to engage with change. And the show has made a commitment to its audience and to its own format, not to engage with change. The commitment runs in both directions. The audience won't let The Simpsons grow up. The show won't let them. And so the sharpest possible version of the thing The Simpsons might have said about American life remains permanently deferred, always one birthday away from being possible, never arriving. This is the loop's deepest cost, not the loss of freshness, which fans argue about constantly, not the continuity errors or the tonal inconsistencies. The deepest cost is the conversation the show can't have about what has happened to the people it depicts, because having that conversation would require it to admit that those people have been standing in one place while the world moved around them. And admitting that would require it to admit that it has been asking its audience to look at a frozen image and call it the present. Springfield is not present day Does America. Springfield is America's memory of itself. It is the preserved image of a middle class, working class family at the end of the 20th century, maintained in aspect by a combination of audience attachment and production commitment, referenced as contemporary while actually functioning as historical document. The show keeps making it contemporary by updating the references, the phones, the apps, the cultural figures. But the underlying social and economic structure of Springfield is the structure of 1989 preserved. This is not a failure. It is the show's deepest honesty. Because the story of the American working class since 1989 is precisely the story of preservation of a structure that was already under pressure in 1989 being maintained through tremendous effort and at increasing cost against forces that have been consistent and systematic in their erosion of everything the structure represented. The Simpsons preserve Springfield not in defiance of this story, but as a document of it. The loop is the show's final statement about the American middle class. This is what it is fighting to maintain. This is what the fight looks like. The couch, the house, the family intact at the end of the episode, everything as it was. The loop isn't their prison. The loop is the story the show is telling. And the story it's telling is about the specific human determination to hold on to the things that matter, even as time and economics and power and circumstance work against the holding. Homer goes to the plant every day. The plant poisons him. Burns doesn't know his name. None of this is reversible or fixable within the show's framework. And Homer keeps going back. He keeps coming home. He keeps finding the family there. That's the show. That's what it has always been about. Section 11 expansion, more hidden details. The show's visual comedy runs on two tracks simultaneously. The track everyone notices, the jokes that are the focus of the scene, the dialogue that carries the story, and the track that operates in the background, in the margins, in the visual layer that the camera points past rather than at. Background jokes in The Simpsons have been documented by fans with encyclopedic thoroughness over the decades, and the picture they reveal is of a writing and production team that took the visual layer seriously as a form of communication independent from the narrative layer. The background jokes are not primarily designed to be noticed. They're designed to exist to reward the pause and rewind viewers, to create a density of content that makes the show inexhaustible in a way that many modern viewers experience as a quality distinct from foreground comedy. The chalkboard gags we discussed deserve a specific survey. Some of the most revealing of these, in the context of what the show was doing at the time they aired. I will not call my teacher hotcakes, from a period when the show was navigating criticism about its depiction of authority figures. Organ transplants are best left to the professionals, a detail that takes on different resonance when you're thinking about Springfield's compromised medical establishment. I am not a 32-year-old woman. From an early season, long before the Hans Moleman age revelation, but creating an echo chamber between the two details that rewards the viewer who tracks them. The cafeteria deep fryer is not a toy, which sounds like standard Bart behavior, but is also a recurring thread in the show's documentation of Springfield Elementary's inadequate safety infrastructure. The progression of the chalkboard gags over 36 years also tells the story of the show's relationship with its own longevity. Early gags are inventive but simple. As the show aged, the gags became increasingly self-referential, less about Bart's transgressions and more about the show's awareness of its own position in television history. The gag about not explaining the plot, the gag about not undermining the network that shows the show, the gags that operate as direct addresses from the production to the audience. These represent the chalkboard evolving from a character detail into a meta-commentary device. The couch gags have undergone a similar evolution, but more dramatically. The couch gag began as a simple variation on a theme. Each week, the family would arrive at the couch by a different route in a different configuration, encountering different obstacles. By the show's second decade, the couch gags had expanded into full short films with their own narrative structures, sometimes longer than the act breaks of the episode they precede. By the third decade, they had become platforms for artistic statement, the Banksy gag, the various internationally animated versions that commented on animation as a form and on The Simpsons specifically as a cultural artifact. The couch gag evolution is the story of a format discovering that its constraint, family arrives at couch, was actually a frame that could contain an enormous amount of expression if approached with the right intention. The family arriving at the couch is the minimum story. Here they are. Everything between the theme music and the family settling in is available for whatever the filmmaker wants to put there. Guest animators have put extraordinary things in that space over the years. The most interesting couch gags, under the framework of the theories we've discussed, are the ones that play with time and sequence. Couch gags in which the family's arrival is shown as a repetitive loop. Couch gags in which the family arrives and the couch is missing or replaced by something wrong. Couch gags in which the sequence is reversed or fragmented or interrupted. These couch gags are operating as direct formal expressions of what the coma theory describes, a dreaming mind replaying its most familiar loop with the variations that dreams introduce, the almost rightness that is the signature of dreaming rather than waking, the specific formal element that makes The Simpsons visually distinctive, its particular character design, the specific proportions of its characters, the way it handles space and depth and color, has been analyzed in detail by animation scholars and by fans who have thought seriously about what the show's visual choices communicate beyond their immediate comedy function. The yellow skin is the most discussed of these choices. Matt Groening has said in various interviews that he chose yellow for the characters because it would be immediately distinctive on television screens. No other show used yellow for human characters. And so any viewer who came across The Simpsons while channel surfing would immediately recognize it as The Simpsons without needing to see the faces or hear the dialogue. This is a production rationale, and it's a good one. But within the show's internal universe, the yellow skin is only unusual if you know it's supposed to be unusual. Inside Springfield, everyone is yellow. The yellow is normal. And the radiation theory's argument is that the yellow skin is what radiation does to this particular population. It's not a stylistic choice within the show's logic, but a symptom, a visible, observable symptom of what the plant has done to the people who live near it that everyone in Springfield has stopped seeing as a symptom because it has been their baseline reality for their entire lives. The four fingers are similarly discussed in production terms. Animators use four-fingered character designs because it simplifies drawing, particularly for the high volume of animation frames required for a weekly series. In production terms, this is the complete explanation. But within the show's logic, four fingers is not a human hand. Four fingers is an alteration. And the same alteration appears on every hand in Springfield, with the exception of visitors from outside the town, who have the five fingers that human hands actually have. The show has noted this discrepancy explicitly at various points as a joke. God in the show has five fingers. When Homer met God, the divine hand was drawn with the correct number of digits. The contrast was intentional. God's anatomy is normal. Springfield's residents' anatomy is not. The show is using the finger count to mark a distinction between the divine and the human in a way that is also, under the radiation theory, marking the distinction between the uncontaminated and the contaminated. God has five fingers. Springfield has four. Something is different about the people inside the contamination zone. The music of the show is rarely discussed in the context of its thematic content, but The Simpsons' musical vocabulary is one of its most sophisticated elements. Alf Clausen, who composed for the show for 30 years, built a musical language that worked on multiple levels simultaneously. It could be straightforwardly comedic, emotionally sincere, ironically deployed, or all three at once within a single cue. The music often communicates what the dialogue is avoiding, moments of genuine, emotional weight are scored with sincerity, even when the scene around them is playing for comedy, creating a tonal complexity that the audience registers even when they're not consciously processing it. The saxophone riff that plays during many of Lisa's scenes is not just a character identifier. It's a musical representation of her isolation, a solo instrument in a scene full of ensemble activity, playing in a register that the other elements of the scene don't harmonically accommodate. The music puts Lisa's loneliness into the soundtrack in a form that operates below the level of dialogue. You hear it before you identify it. You feel the isolation before you see it demonstrated. Similarly, the recurring musical motifs associated with Burns are scored in ways that communicate threat and antiquity. They borrow from the vocabulary of horror film scoring while remaining just inside the boundaries of comedy. The music tells you something is wrong with Burns before any specific detail of the scene confirms it. The scoring communicates that Burns is a different kind of entity from the other characters, that he operates in a different register of reality, older, colder, less subject to the rules that govern everyone around him. The Simpsons has been communicating through its music for 36 years in ways that most audience members process as emotional response without consciously identifying the mechanism. The music is one more layer of the show's hidden language, one more channel through which the second Springfield, the honest one, sends signals through the foreground of the one that's presenting the comedy. All of these layers, the chalkboard gags, the couch gags, the visual design, the music, the background details, constitute a secondary text that runs parallel to the primary text of the show as episode narratives. The secondary text is more honest than the primary one. It operates with less constraint, less network pressure, less concern for the family friendly comedy obligation that governs what the foreground can and cannot say directly. In the margins, the show has been saying things for 36 years that the episodes themselves can only approach. The hidden details are not Easter eggs in the promotional sense. They're not rewards placed there purely for the attentive viewer's pleasure. They're the show's conscience expressed in the spaces where the conscience can speak without being edited. Springfield is full of secrets that are not actually hidden. They're just placed in the background, trusted to the peripheral vision of anyone who's been watching long enough to stop looking only at what the show is pointing at and start looking at everything else. Everything else is where the show is most honest. Everything else is where Springfield tells you, quietly and consistently, and without expectation of acknowledgement, what it really is. And what it really is, after 36 years and 788 episodes, and every theory, and every background gag, and every chalkboard line, and every couch gag, and every piece of music that played under a scene that was trying to make you laugh, while simultaneously trying to make you feel something true. What Springfield really is home. Not the home you have, the home you want. The home that's always there when you go back to it, always exactly as you left it, always full of the same people who are always the same people, always about to make the same mistakes and get back up from them and be together at the end of the episode in the same house, on the same street, in the same impossible town that doesn't appear on any map because it doesn't need to. It's already inside you. It always was. End of expansion content to be integrated into full script Section 5 MR. Burns, the oldest man in America, Charles Montgomery Burns, should not be alive. This is not a metaphorical statement. Within the established facts of the show's own internal continuity, Burns's age and condition represent a genuine biological impossibility, and the show has been building the details of that impossibility so carefully and so consistently across 36 years that it's starting to look less like a running gag and more like a portrait of what immortality actually costs. Start with the timeline. Burns has, across different episodes, referenced personal memories from before the turn of the 20th century. He has described first-hand experience of events from the early 1900s. He served in World War II in a capacity the show depicts as morally ambiguous at best. He knew Howard Hughes personally. He attended Yale at some point in the distant past. He has spoken about the Gilded Age not as history, not as something he learned from books, but as lived experience, as the world that shaped him. He has described the Spanish American War with the casual familiarity of someone who was there. The most conservative reading of the show's canon places Burns at somewhere above 100 years old. More liberal readings, accounting for all the historical references scattered across dozens of episodes, push that number closer to 140. Either way, the character is operating in a range that no human biology can account for, and he's not just surviving in a diminished capacity. Burns runs a multi-billion-dollar corporation. He manipulates the politics of an entire town. He orchestrates complex, multi-phase schemes that require sustained strategic thinking, detailed knowledge of modern financial and legal systems, and the ability to anticipate how other people will respond to moves made weeks or months in advance. His physical body is frail, his strength is nearly absent, and the show plays this for comedy repeatedly, with Burns unable to open a door or lift a telephone without visible effort. but his mind is, by any fair assessment, the sharpest in Springfield. Burns is the most strategically intelligent character in the show, and he has been operating at that level for longer than any human being should be able to sustain consciousness. The Springfield Files episode we discussed earlier in relation to the radiation theory contains the show's most direct engagement with how Burns has remained alive. After his weekly medical treatment, a regimen so intensive that it causes his body to emit a visible green glow, Burns wanders through the nearby woods in a disoriented state. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly 7 more days. Miss a dose, and his biological systems fail. His life is maintained on a weekly maintenance schedule with zero margin for error. The treatment involves radiation. Of course it does. The man who owns a nuclear power plant, whose facility has been leaking radioactive material into Springfield's environment for decades, sustains his own life through controlled radiation exposure. His body has been altered by a century of proximity to nuclear material to the point where it cannot function through normal cellular processes. He requires external input. He is, in the most literal sense the show allows itself, powered by the same substance that has been slowly remaking Springfield's population. This creates a closed loop. Burns profits from the plant's energy production. The plant's radiation leaks into the environment and alters the population. Burns manages his own radiation exposure through treatments funded by the plant's revenue. The plant requires an incompetent safety inspector to prevent it from being shut down. Burns ensures that inspector remains employed. The inspector ensures the violations continue. The violations ensure the radiation keeps flowing. The radiation ensures the population stays compromised. The compromised population can't organize effective resistance. Burns continues to profit. The loop has no exit. Now consider the medical specifics of Burns's condition as the show has described them. In one of the series' most quoted scenes, Burns visits a doctor who informs him that he has every disease known to medical science, every single one simultaneously present in his body at the same time. The doctor explains this situation using the phrase Three Stooges syndrome. The diseases are all trying to kill Burns simultaneously, but because they're all present at once, they create a biological gridlock. Each disease blocks every other disease from progressing. Nothing can actually kill him because everything is competing for the right to kill him, and the competition itself produces stasis. Played for laughs, as it is, this scene is one of the best jokes in the show's history. But if you accept the radiation theory and the context it provides, the scene describes something more specific and more terrifying. Burns's disease equilibrium isn't maintained by any natural process. The weekly radiation treatments are doing it. They don't cure his diseases. They keep every illness in exact stasis, balanced against every other illness, preventing any single condition from gaining dominance. It's not medicine in any conventional therapeutic sense, it's maintenance. It's the biological equivalent of adjusting control rods in a nuclear reactor to prevent runaway reactions. Burns's body is the reactor. His weekly treatments are the control mechanism. Without them, everything goes critical. This reframes Smithers entirely. Waylon Smithers' devotion to Burns is one of the show's longest-running character dynamics, and the show has been relatively open about its emotional complexity. Smithers' feelings for Burns go beyond professional loyalty into something more complicated that the show has acknowledged without fully exploring. But the radiation theory adds a layer to the Smithers-Burns relationship that's less about emotion and more about infrastructure. Smithers manages Burns' schedule. Smithers ensures Burns makes every weekly treatment. Smithers monitors Burns' condition with the kind of attention that the show has framed as bordering on obsession, but might more accurately be described as necessity. If Smithers leaves, Burns misses a treatment. If Burns misses a treatment, the disease equilibrium collapses. If the equilibrium collapses, Burns dies. Smithers isn't devoted to Burns only because of emotional attachment, whatever the precise nature of that attachment. Smithers is devoted because he has been in proximity to Burns long enough to understand exactly how Burns stays alive, and he knows that his own presence is a structural requirement of that survival. His loyalty isn't just personal, it's practical in the most direct possible sense. Smithers staying means Burns lives, and Smithers knows this, and Burns knows this, and neither of them has ever said it out loud, but it operates as the actual foundation of their relationship underneath all the personal complexity. Burns' connection to historical events provides additional texture for thinking about his survival. The show has depicted Burns referencing or having personal involvement in events that span more than a century of American history. He stole $1 trillion bill from the United States government during World War II and kept it hidden for decades. He described his involvement in events from the early 1900s with the specificity that comes from memory, not research. He has spoken about his family's wealth with a temporal scope suggesting the Burns dynasty predates the Industrial Revolution. The Burns family wealth is described in the show as one of the oldest and most continuously powerful fortunes in American history. Not wealthy in the way that most wealthy Americans are wealthy, not built in a generation through enterprise or inheritance. Wealthy in the way that shapes national infrastructure, the kind of wealth that builds systems and then charges everyone else to use them. The kind of wealth that, by the time a democratic government existed that might have regulated it, had already become too large and too entrenched to meaningfully constrain. Burns inherited this legacy. He didn't create it from scratch. He took control of an empire that was already ancient when he arrived and extended it through the 20th century and into the 21st. And this raises a question the show has never answered. Is Burns unique in his family's history, or has the Burns dynasty always had access to methods of life extension? Before nuclear radiation, before modern medicine, before any of the technology currently keeping Burns alive, did previous Burns patriarchs use other means? The show establishes that the Burns family has been in continuous control of their fortune for longer than most American institutions have existed. That kind of generational continuity doesn't occur through normal succession. Fortunes dissipate, families fracture, power disperses. The fact that the Burns name has been attached to this specific empire for centuries suggests either extraordinary luck across many generations or that the Burns family has always had access to resources the rest of the population didn't. Burns's relationship to death itself is worth examining separately. He has come closer to dying than almost any other recurring character in the series. He was shot and survived. He has collapsed, been hospitalized, been abandoned in wilderness, been poisoned, been attacked, been exposed to his own plant's output at levels that would immediately kill most people. And every time he comes back, not through the cartoon resilience that Homer displays. Homer endures damage and his body simply absorbs it. Burns comes back through infrastructure, through the machinery of wealth that ensures no matter what happens to his physical body, there will always be resources available for reconstruction. Homer's survivability is passive. He gets hit and doesn't die because the show needs him not to die. Burns' survivability is engineered. Every institution he's compromised, every politician he's purchased, every doctor he's retained, every research facility he's funded, it all exists at some level to serve the single goal of keeping Burns alive. His empire is, ultimately, a life support system disguised as a corporation. And the scariest aspect of this, the detail that sticks after you've thought about it for a while, is that Springfield needs Burns alive too. The town's economy depends on the plant's operation. The plant's operation depends on Burns's ownership. Burns's survival depends on the treatments. The treatments depend on the revenue the plant generates. Everything is interdependent. Burns cannot die without the system he built finally having to answer for what it's done to the people who live inside it. And the system's designed to prevent that reckoning from ever arriving. Burns is too expensive to die. Springfield will keep paying the bill for as long as Burns keeps the lights on. And based on his treatment schedule, based on the infrastructure he's built to sustain himself, based on the centuries of accumulated wealth available to fund his continued existence, that may, in the most literal possible sense, be forever. Section 6, Mona Simpson and the Three-Generation Conspiracy for the first 6 seasons of The Simpsons. Homer's mother was dead. That was the established fact. Abe Simpson had told Homer that his mother died when Homer was young. He had shown Homer a grave. Homer had mourned. He had grown into an adult carrying the particular wound of a boy whose mother left before he was old enough to understand why, and the show had used that wound, quietly, persistently, without always naming it directly, to explain almost everything about who Homer became. Homer's desperate need for approval, his terror of abandonment, his clinginess toward Marge, his willingness to endure humiliation and disrespect from Burns without ever meaningfully pushing back, his compulsive need to be liked by the people around him to the point where he'll absorb almost any mistreatment rather than risk the relationship that the mistreatment is occurring within. Homer Simpson's personality is, at its core, a coping structure built around a child's experience of being left. Everything about how Homer moves through the world can be traced back to one thing he believes, at some foundational level, that he is the kind of person people leave. And in season 7, The show revealed that the death was a lie. The episode is called Mother Simpson. It aired in November of 1995. Homer, in the process of faking his own death to avoid work, goes to the Hall of Records to correct the error and discovers something in the municipal records that changes everything. His mother is alive. She never died. The grave Abe showed him wasn't hers. It belonged to Walt Whitman, the poet. Abe had been passing off a famous writer's headstone as his wife's burial marker for Homer's entire life. Homer finds Mona at the cemetery where she is visiting what she believes is her son's grave. She doesn't recognize him at first. He's grown into someone she couldn't have predicted when she last saw him as a child. But when Homer proves who he is, the reunion is one of the most emotionally genuine scenes the show has ever produced. Two people so separated by more than 2 decades, finding each other in a grave that belongs to neither of them. And then Mona tells Homer the truth. She didn't die. She didn't stop loving him. She left because she had to, because staying would have put Homer and Abe in direct danger, because the man who would grow up to be Homer's employer had destroyed her life and driven her underground. The story begins in 1969. Mona was, by the show's description, an ordinary housewife, married to Abe, mother of a young Homer, living a quiet life in Springfield while the world outside was moving through the civil rights movement and the Vietnam protests and the counterculture. And then something changed. Mona was radicalized. The show presents this with its usual mixture of comedy and genuine weight. She joined a group of activists who had identified a specific target, a biological weapons laboratory owned by Mr. Burns, a facility in Springfield, the same town where Homer was growing up, where families were living their ordinary lives, where Burns was cooking up weapons grade pathogens a short distance from residential neighborhoods. This is a detail the show drops into the narrative and then largely moves past, but it deserves to be held in place for a moment. Burns, at the same time he was operating the nuclear power plant with its 342 safety violations, was also running a germ warfare facility in the same community, manufacturing biological weapons in a town full of civilians who had no idea the laboratory existed. The nuclear plant contaminating their water was not the only industrial hazard Burns had installed in Springfield. He had also put within reach of the same families and the same children a facility producing pathogens capable of mass casualties. Mona and her group broke into the lab and detonated what the show describes as an antibiotic bomb, destroying the biological agents stored inside. During the raid, they accidentally cured the asthma of the facility's security guard, who happened to be Clancy Wiggum, the man who would later become Springfield's chief of police. The raid succeeded. The germs were destroyed. But as the group fled, Mona stopped. Someone had been knocked down in the chaos. She turned to help. It was Burns. She stopped to help the man whose weapons she had just destroyed, and Burns saw her face. He identified her. He reported her to the FBI. And from that moment, Mona Simpson was a wanted woman. She couldn't go home. She couldn't contact her family. She couldn't hold her son or tell him anything. She left while Homer was asleep. She kissed him goodbye in the dark and disappeared into an underground life that lasted 27 years. Homer woke up and his mother was gone. Abe told him she was dead, and Homer spent 3 decades believing he was the kind of son a mother would rather die than stay for, believing there was something fundamentally wrong with him that made people leave, believing at some cellular level that love was conditional and its conditions were ones he couldn't reliably meet. Now, here is where the conspiracy takes shape because Burns didn't just identify Mona to the authorities, he pursued her. Actively, personally, across decades, using his resources and his connections to ensure she could never return to her family. When Mona finally comes back to Springfield in season 7, Burns recognizes her almost immediately. He sees her through a cab window and calls the FBI. The Bureau arrives at the Simpson house. Mona has to flee again. Homer has to say goodbye to his mother for the second time, but this time he knows why she left the first time. He knows who forced her out. He knows that the man responsible for his mother's absence across his entire childhood is the same man who signs his paycheck. And Homer doesn't connect the dots. He doesn't confront Burns. He doesn't quit. He doesn't even seem to process the connection fully. The show plays this as tragedy rather than oversight. Homer's inability to make this connection isn't a failure of the plot. It's a statement about what decades of radiation exposure and a crayon in the brain and chronic emotional suppression do to a person's capacity for cause and effect reasoning. Homer cannot follow the chain from his mother's absence to his employer's deliberate action because his brain literally cannot maintain the chain long enough to reach its end. Burns didn't just ruin Mona's life. Burns engineered Homer's. By driving Mona away when Homer was a child, Burns ensured that Homer would grow into adulthood emotionally damaged in exactly the ways that make him the ideal powerless employee, desperate for approval from authority figures, incapable of sustained resistance, terrified of abandonment to the point where accepting mistreatment feels safer than risking the loss of the relationship the mistreatment is occurring within. Homer works at a dangerous facility for a man who cannot remember his name because the alternative, being alone, being unloved, being left again, is worse. Burns knew this. Burns engineered this. The broken version of Homer is precisely the kind of worker the plant required. The show confirms this with a detail that arrives later in the series. Burns and Grandpa Simpson had made a deal. Burns had committed a crime that Abe discovered. In exchange for Abe's silence, Burns guaranteed that Homer would always have a job at the plant, no matter what. No matter how many violations he caused, how many incidents he created, how many times the German investors who briefly owned the facility tried to fire him. 742 documented errors. Homer was never permanently let go. His job security wasn't a cartoon convenience. It was a contractual obligation between his father and his mother's persecutor, brokered in silence, maintained in secret, and never explained to Homer. Because explaining it would mean explaining everything else. And if Homer ever understood the full architecture of his situation, he might do something unpredictable with that understanding. 3 generations. Abe made a deal with Burns to protect his own secret. Mona fought Burns and spent her adult life as a fugitive because of the consequences. Homer inherited the wreckage of both of their choices and never had the cognitive tools to understand why his life felt the weight it felt. Burns sat at the center of all of it, profiting from each transaction, maintaining the system that kept the Simpson family exactly where he needed. Then Mona died in a later season. The scene is one of the show's quietest and most devastating moments. Homer sits beside her. He holds her hand. He watches the mother he barely knew slip away for the last time. No joke breaks the scene. No cutaway provides relief. Just a man and his mother and the weight of 27 stolen years. And then the weight becomes permanent. The Simpsons is, among other things, a story about what concentrated power does to families. Burns has been the mechanism of the Simpson family's suffering across 3 generations. He didn't intend to target them specifically. Mona crossed his path, he responded with the resources available to him, and the consequences cascaded downward through the family tree. That's not malice, it's something colder. It's the way power operates when it has no accountability, not through targeted malice, but through the casual deployment of whatever force is necessary to protect existing arrangements, with no particular concern for what that force destroys on its way to its target. Mona fought back. She was good and brave, and she fought for something worth fighting for, and she lost everything anyway. Because in Springfield, as we'll keep returning to, the man with the money writes the rules, and the rules are written to ensure that this exact outcome keeps occurring. Section 7. Where is Springfield? The geography that can't be mapped Springfield is the most famous fictional American town in history. More people can identify it than can name the capital of half the states in the actual country. It has a nuclear power plant, a tire fire, a gorge, a harbor, a monorail, an elementary school, a prison, 2 hospitals, and a quickie mart. It has mountains and oceans and deserts and farmland and forests, and these geographic features exist in what appears to be relatively close proximity to one another. It borders Ohio, Nevada, Maine, and Kentucky, depending on which episode you're watching. It has been placed on the coast and in the heartland and near the Canadian border and near Mexico. It experiences weather that ranges from blizzards to tropical heat waves within a single season. Springfield does not exist in any state because Springfield exists in all of them simultaneously. This is not an accident. The show has been deliberately, systematically, and with obvious enjoyment contradicting itself about Springfield's location for its entire run. Every time a clue appears that seems to narrow down the possibilities, a zip code, an area code, a state abbreviation, a reference to a neighboring body of water, another clue arrives in a subsequent episode that cancels it out. The show teases the answer and then pulls it away over and over for 36 years. The state abbreviation shown in certain episodes is NT, which is not a real American state. Lisa's area code has been identified as a Missouri prefix in at least one episode. When Homer calls the state capitol's office, the voice on the other end identifies the state as one beginning with a vowel, which eliminates some candidates but still leaves a meaningful number. Every clue seems to gesture at an answer before undermining it. Matt Groening, the show's creator, appeared to resolve this in 2012. He told Smithsonian Magazine that he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, because he grew up near there and chose the name because Springfield is one of the most common city names in the United States. He wanted the town to feel like it could be anywhere. For approximately 48 hours, the mystery appeared to be solved. Springfield was in Oregon. Case closed. The writers immediately continued contradicting this. Episodes that aired after the interview placed Springfield in geographic contexts that are not compatible with Oregon. The production staff didn't honor Groening's confession. The mystery was preserved because, as it became clear, the mystery is the point. Springfield's location isn't a puzzle with a hidden answer. It's a puzzle that has been specifically designed to remain unsolvable. The surface reading of this is straightforward and has been confirmed by multiple people involved with the show's production. Springfield is meant to represent every American town simultaneously. It's designed to be familiar to every viewer, regardless of where they actually live. By giving it the geographic features of multiple real American regions, the show ensures that no viewer can look at Springfield and say, "That's not my world." Someone from the Pacific Northwest recognizes the mountains. Someone from the Gulf Coast recognizes the heat and the water. Someone from the Midwest recognizes the flat residential streets and the industrial decay. Springfield is every place at once so that it can feel like home to everyone. That intention is real, and it's been executed effectively for 3 decades. But there's a second layer, less comfortable, that opens up when you apply the framework of the other theories we've discussed. The coma theory handles Springfield's geography with particular elegance. Homer's unconscious brain doesn't have a precise geographic map. It has impressions and fragments, emotional residue from every place Homer ever visited or saw on a screen or heard described. Mountains from a family vacation that made an impression, ocean from a television commercial, desert from a movie, farmland from a drive through the middle of the country. His sleeping mind assembled Springfield from all of these fragments without applying any geographic logic to their arrangement, because dreams don't have geographic logic. Dreams have emotional logic. The place feels true even when it makes no physical sense, because the feelings associated with each element are real even when their arrangement is impossible. Springfield feels like America because it is assembled from Homer's memory of America, which is scattered, incomplete, nonlinear, and held together by feeling rather than by map. The radiation theory offers a different and stranger reading. If Springfield's contaminated environment has genuinely altered the biological rules for its residents, if people can have yellow skin and 4 fingers and survive falls that would kill a normal human, why should the rules of geography be exempt? If the contamination affects organic systems at a fundamental level, perhaps it also affects the physical environment in ways that allow incompatible geographic features to exist in close proximity. A mountain range and a beachfront and a desert, all within driving distance of each other, would be impossible under normal physical law. But Springfield has established repeatedly that normal physical law applies differently inside the town's boundaries than it does outside them. The most useful reading from the conspiracy perspective, though, is the one that connects Springfield's unmappable location to its legal and regulatory situation. You cannot bring charges against a facility if you cannot establish which jurisdiction it operates under. You cannot hold a corporation accountable for environmental violations if the state it's located in keeps changing. The EPA can seal Springfield under a dome in the movie, but in the regular show's universe, the perpetual ambiguity of Springfield's location means that no single regulatory authority has ever been clearly established as responsible for what happens there. Burns's plant has been operating with 342 documented safety violations for decades. It has been dumping radioactive waste into local water sources. It has been poisoning the surrounding community. And yet, no federal investigation has resulted in prosecution. No state environmental agency has shut it down. No governing body has exercised effective oversight. Some of this is attributable to Burns's ability to purchase political compliance, but some of it may simply be the consequence of the town's extraordinary geographic ambiguity. Nobody has clear jurisdiction over Springfield. And in a regulatory environment that requires clear jurisdiction for action, unclear jurisdiction is as good as immunity. Springfield floats between states because floating is safer than landing. Landing means a permanent address. A permanent address means a specific regulatory authority. A specific regulatory authority means someone with actual power to investigate the three-eyed fish and the cracked cooling towers and the billionaire who remembers things that happened before most of the country's current residents were born. The episode Behind the Laughter, the show's mockumentary from season 12, offered the most specific geographic claim the show has ever made. In the original broadcast, the family was described as being from northern Kentucky. In syndicated reruns, location was changed to a different state. The answer literally depends on which version of the episode you're watching. The show gave you the truth and then changed the truth depending on the platform. Even when Springfield has a definitive answer, the answer isn't definitive. It shifts, it changes, it refuses to hold still. Every state in the country has been theorized as Springfield's home at some point, and every theory has evidence and contradictory evidence in roughly equal measure. The show designed this state of permanent ambiguity, has maintained it for 36 years, and shows no signs of resolving it. Springfield will never be placed on a real map, not because the show can't decide, but because a town that could be anywhere belongs to everyone. And a town that belongs to everyone is a town that nobody has the authority to shut down. Section 8. The predictions phenomenon.
Why The Simpsons keeps coming true.
Let's talk about the predictions. You've seen the screenshots. You've seen the viral posts. You've heard the incredulous headlines. The Simpsons predicted it again. The show has become, in the cultural imagination of the 2020s, almost as famous for what it apparently foresaw as for its actual content. And the truth behind this phenomenon is more interesting than either the conspiracy theories or the debunking tend to acknowledge. Start with the big ones, because they deserve to be named before we start examining. In the year 2000, episode Bart to the Future depicted a future in which Lisa Simpson had become the first female president of the United States. Lisa's predecessor in the Oval Office was identified as Donald Trump. The episode aired 16 years before Trump won the 2016 election. In a 1995 episode, a wrist-mounted device appeared that functioned in ways remarkably similar to what would eventually become the modern smartwatch. In 1998, the show depicted the Walt Disney Company acquiring 20th Century Fox. That acquisition happened in 2019. In a 1993 episode, a flu virus originating in Asia spread to Springfield, causing mass panic, supply shortages, and a frantic search for a cure. The episode aired 27 years before COVID-19. In the same episode, the townspeople accidentally released a swarm of aggressive insects, and during the actual 2020 pandemic, Asian giant hornets, dubbed murder hornets by the media, appeared in the United States for the first time. In 1996, Homerpalooza featured a joke where Cypress Hill accidentally booked the London Symphony Orchestra. In 2024, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra at the Royal Albert Hall, 28 years after the joke. A 1994 episode sent Homer to space alongside a real astronaut, decades before commercial space tourism became a reality. A 1998 episode contained a background equation that mathematicians later identified as appearing to predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle, confirmed experimentally in 2012. In a 1999 episode, Homer proposes that the universe might be shaped like a donut, and in subsequent years, some cosmologists found radiation patterns suggesting the universe might actually be toroidal in structure. These are the hits, the ones that get screenshotted and shared and accompanied by, okay, how are they doing this? Al Jean, the show's long-serving executive producer, has answered this question directly. His answer is precise and honest. If you throw enough darts, some of them are going to hit bullseyes. That's it. The Simpsons has produced nearly 800 episodes across 36 years. Each episode contains multiple jokes, references, satirical observations, and speculative premises. When you generate that volume of content over that long a period, some of it will align with future events through statistical probability alone. Producer Bill Oakley, who ran the show during some of its most celebrated seasons, was even more direct. The episodes are so old that history simply repeats itself. Fact-checking organizations have systematically examined many of the most viral prediction claims and found simpler explanations for most of them. The show didn't predict Trump's presidency from nothing. Trump had been publicly flirting with a presidential run since the late 1980s. By 2000, when the episode aired, he was a recognizable cultural figure who had repeatedly gestured at political ambition. The Bart to the Future episode wasn't forecasting an impossible outcome. It was pushing an existing trajectory to its satirical conclusion. The writers observed that celebrity culture and political culture were increasingly blurred, identified Trump as a recognizable symbol of that blurring, and wrote a joke about where that trajectory might eventually lead. The Disney-Fox prediction follows the same logic. Media consolidation was an accelerating trend throughout the 1990s and 2000s. The Simpsons itself was a Fox property. Writers working at Fox would have had a clear and detailed understanding of corporate consolidation dynamics in the entertainment industry. Writing a joke about a mega corporation swallowing its competitors wasn't prophecy, it was informed satire. The smartwatch episode observed that technology was consistently trending toward miniaturization and increasing personal integration. Imagining a wrist mounted computer device was a logical extrapolation of a trend that was already visible to anyone paying attention. The Simpsons writing room has historically been one of the most formally educated in American television. Multiple writers have degrees from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and other research universities. Many have backgrounds in mathematics, physics, computer science, economics, political theory. These are not people generating random guesses. They're highly educated observers of American culture and technology who spend their working lives studying trends, analyzing patterns, and asking, where does this go next? And then following that question to its most absurd but logically consistent conclusion. They're not predicting the future. They're reading the present more carefully than most people do and projecting its implications forward a few steps. When those projections eventually materialize in reality, the audience experience what feels like deja vu, but is actually the result of having been culturally prepared for the outcome years in advance. This is where the phenomenon gets genuinely interesting because there's a feedback loop here that the standard debunking misses. Consider the Trump prediction specifically. In 2000, the show depicted a Trump presidency. Millions of people saw it. It became a reference point in American cultural memory. When Trump announced his candidacy in 2015, the Simpsons reference was immediately surfaced and widely circulated. The image of Trump descending an escalator while announcing his candidacy was visually echoed in screenshots from the 2000 episode, and those screenshots went viral with accompanying commentary about how the show had predicted this moment. What effect does that have? At minimum, it makes the Trump presidency feel familiar rather than shocking to the people who saw those screenshots. It frames an unprecedented political event within a cultural reference that millions of people already have. The novelty is reduced. The event feels like something that was always coming rather than something that arrived from nowhere. The Simpsons didn't predict the Trump presidency, but The Simpsons, through its reach, through the durability of its cultural presence, through the way its references persist in the collective memory of its audience, may have contributed to the cultural conditions in which a Trump presidency felt to some voters like an inevitable punchline rather than a catastrophic aberration. The show shapes perception of the future as much as it reflects it. When The Simpsons depicts something, it enters the cultural bloodstream. It becomes a frame through which subsequent real events get processed. A Disney acquisition of Fox feels less startling when you've already seen that joke. Commercial space tourism feels less revolutionary when Homer already went to space in your childhood. The show normalizes its own predictions in the act of making them, so that when the predictions land, the audience's response isn't shock, it's recognition. We've seen this before. The Simpsons already went here. Springfield doesn't reflect America. America increasingly resembles Springfield. The show held up a mirror for 36 years, and the audience stared into it long enough that they started to match what they saw. The nuclear plant with its ignored violations, the corrupt billionaire who owns the town's energy infrastructure, the government that's a perpetual source of incompetent comedy, the population that keeps experiencing the same catastrophes and forgetting them by the following week, the endless cycle of disaster and reset with no one accountable for anything. The show wrote this down in 1989 and has been updating it every season since, and at some point it stopped being satire of a fictional place and became documentation of the actual one. But here is the piece of honest accounting that any fair treatment of the predictions phenomenon has to include. The show has made thousands of predictions that haven't come true, jokes about jetpacks and moon colonies, political outcomes that went the other way, technological forecasts that never materialized, social shifts that didn't happen. Nobody takes screenshots of these. Nobody shares them on social media. Nobody writes articles about the Simpsons getting it wrong because confirmation bias only operates in one direction. We remember the hits, we discard the misses, and when you run a confirmation bias filter on 800 episodes of densely packed satirical content and share only the results that aligned with subsequent reality, you end up with a highlight reel that looks supernatural. The predictions aren't supernatural. They're not even particularly conspiratorial. They're what you get when a brilliantly written show runs for an impossibly long time staffed by highly educated observers of American culture, generating more satirical content than any other show in television history, and then having that content filtered through the most powerful confirmation bias engine ever built, which is the contemporary internet. The Simpsons wrote enough possible futures that some of them were statistically bound to arrive. The internet remembered only those ones. But even knowing how the mechanism works, even understanding the statistics and the confirmation bias and the difference between informed extrapolation and genuine prophecy, even with all of that in hand, the next time a Simpsons clip from 1997 lines up precisely with a 2025 headline, you're going to pause, you're going to feel the thing. That recognition, that sense that the show knew something it shouldn't. And the reason you're going to feel it, even knowing better, is that the show has been right so many times before that the feeling of recognition has been reinforced to the point where it's almost involuntary. 800 episodes, 36 years, thousands of observations about American culture and technology and politics and human nature, enough darts to cover every wall. And the bullseyes have been in such specific, such eerily precise locations that even the show's own creators have admitted on record to occasionally pausing and wondering if they know something they shouldn't. They probably don't. But the wondering is real, and the wondering is exactly what makes this phenomenon, as an artifact of how culture and media and memory interact, genuinely fascinating, regardless of whether any supernatural explanation applies. Section 9. The supporting cast dark secrets. Ned, Skinner, MOE, Sideshow Bob, and more. Springfield is not a small town. It has a population that the show has never been consistent about. Estimates within the series have placed it anywhere from 6,000 residents to several hundred thousand. But regardless of the precise number, it has given us dozens of recurring characters whose individual stories, when examined with the same attention we've given the main family, reveal a town that is far darker and far more complex than its comedy reputation suggests. Let's start with the person the show has quietly destroyed more thoroughly than anyone else, Ned Flanders. On the surface, Ned is everything Homer Simpson is not. He's kind to a degree that reads as almost pathological. He's generous with his time, his money, his emotions. He's devoutly religious and takes that devotion seriously. He's physically fit, financially responsible, an attentive father to his two sons, a patient neighbor to a man who has, across 36 years, borrowed without returning, damaged without repairing, and caused harm without acknowledging it. Ned is, by any objective measurement, a better person than Homer in essentially every category the show tracks, and the show punishes him for it relentlessly, without mercy, and with a consistency that, once you notice it, stops being funny in the simple way it was originally designed to be. His wife Maud died. Not in a heroic way, not in a way that gave her death narrative meaning in proportion to her importance as a character. She was killed by a t-shirt cannon at a Springfield Speedway event. The cannon misfired because Homer was dodging the shirts, and they hit Maud instead. Homer's reflexive self-preservation literally killed Ned's wife, and Ned forgave him, because Ned always forgives. It's what Ned does. It's the core of who he is, the defining feature of his character across decades of episodes. But the show, to its credit, eventually showed you what this forgiveness actually is. The hurricane episode. A massive storm destroys Ned's house. The community rallies to rebuild it, which sounds like exactly the heartwarming neighborhood story you'd expect from a show like this. But the rebuild is a disaster. The house is reconstructed so incompetently, so completely without care or craft that it collapses the first time Ned opens the door. And something in Ned breaks. He stands in the wreckage and he screams, not at the storm, at the town, at Homer, at every person who has ever treated his goodness as a resource to be extracted, his patience as an invitation to impose, his forgiveness as a renewable asset rather than a finite one. He screams things he has been swallowing for decades, and then he's committed to a mental health facility. He has a breakdown so complete that the professional response is institutionalization. In therapy, the roots of Ned's character are revealed. He was not a naturally kind child. He was violent, uncontrollable, disruptive, a kid with tremendous energy and no framework for directing it constructively. His parents, being committed adherents of a parenting philosophy that rejected conventional discipline, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him through intensive behavioral modification. Ned's gentleness isn't a personality trait, it's a cage. It was built around a very different person by a professional who spent years making sure that person couldn't get out. Everything about Ned reads differently once you have this. His patience with Homer is not saintly. It's the product of neural wiring that was altered before he was old enough to consent to the alteration. He literally cannot express anger in the normal register because his brain was reprogrammed to suppress it at any cost. His faith isn't just conviction, it's a scaffolding, an external framework that gives his suppressed self something to organize around. Without the structure of religious practice, without the daily rituals and the community and the moral framework, there's nothing between Ned and the person who would exist if the conditioning ever fully failed. And God ignores Ned. This is the detail that makes the Ned Flanders story genuinely haunting. The show has, within its own universe, depicted God as a real entity. Homer has spoken directly to God on multiple occasions. God has appeared to Homer, conversed with him, and the show played this as both comedy and genuine theological engagement. God talks to Homer Simpson, a man who sleeps during sermons, who finds most religious observance an inconvenience, who treats the divine with approximately the same respect he treats everything else, which is to say, he'll engage enthusiastically for about 40 seconds and then lose interest. Ned Flanders has dedicated his entire life to faith. He goes to church every week, he reads scripture, he volunteers, he tithed before most of his neighbors knew what the word meant. He has organized his entire existence around the relationship with God that he believes genuinely and completely is the most important relationship available to a person. And God has never spoken to Ned, not once. In all the episodes, across all the seasons, in all the moments where Ned has prayed and asked for something specific and needed an answer, the answer hasn't come. God talks to Homer. God is silent to Ned. The man who does nothing right gets divine conversation. The man who has structured his entire life around worthiness gets silence. This is not random. The show is making a precise and unsentimental statement. It is telling you that moral virtue in Springfield's universe is not what the cosmos rewards. The system, whether you call it Burns's empire or the radiation or the collective social compact or simply the logic of how Springfield operates, rewards compliance and endurance. Burns is compliant with his own ambitions. Homer endures whatever is put in front of him. They both get what they want. Ned does everything right by any moral standard the show takes seriously, and he keeps getting his house knocked down. The relationship between Homer and Ned is the show's central philosophical argument, running alongside its comedy. Homer does everything wrong, and the universe absorbs his failures with a shrug. Ned does everything right, and the universe replies with consistent, detailed, specifically calibrated loss. They live next door to each other for 36 years. The gap between them never closes. The show never suggests the gap will close. Because the gap isn't a problem to be solved, it's a feature of the environment, now Skinner. Or more precisely, Armin Tamzarian. The principal in the Pauper episode is consistently ranked among the most disliked in the show's history. Harry Shearer, the voice of Skinner, publicly expressed his displeasure. Critics called it a betrayal of the character, a retcon so severe that it damaged everything the show had built around the principle of Springfield Elementary. The internet has been calling it the moment The Simpsons lost the plot for 28 years. But the episode isn't a failure, it's a diagnosis. And the reason it feels like a betrayal is that it tells you something about Springfield that the show had previously let you discover obliquely, and it tells you directly. Here's what happens. A stranger arrives in Springfield and introduces himself as the real Seymour Skinner, a decorated Vietnam veteran who was captured as a prisoner of war and presumed dead. He survived, he came home, and he found someone else living his life. The man Springfield has known as Principal Skinner is actually Armin Tamzarian, a former street criminal who had served in the same Vietnam unit as the real Skinner. When Skinner was captured and presumed killed, Tamzarian felt responsible. He traveled to Springfield to inform Skinner's mother Agnes of her son's death. Agnes assumed he was her son. And Tamzarian, who had never been wanted by anyone, who had no identity worth keeping, simply became the person she needed him to be. He lived inside that stolen identity for 20 years. He built a life around it. He became, in every meaningful, practical sense, the person Springfield needed him to be in the role he occupied. And then the real Seymour Skinner walked through the door. Springfield held a community meeting. Both men were present. The truth was fully and publicly established. Every person in the room understood that their principal of 20 years was a fraud. And the town voted. Not on consequences, not on prosecution, not on restoration. They voted on whether to acknowledge the truth at all. The verdict was unanimous. They voted to keep the lie. Judge Schneider issued a legal decree that Tamzarian was henceforth the real Skinner. The actual Seymour Skinner The war hero, whose identity had been occupied for 2 decades, was tied to a railroad car and physically expelled from Springfield. And the judge had explicitly legally illegal to mention the truth again under penalty of pain and suffering. The audience watching this episode found it horrifying. The critics found it horrifying. The production staff, to some extent, found it horrifying. But the town of Springfield found it entirely acceptable. Because from Springfield's perspective, it was the rational choice. They had a principal who functioned. The town's institutional infrastructure required a person in that role. The truth would have been costly, emotionally, practically, institutionally costly. The lie was already in place and running smoothly. The cost of maintaining the lie was simply agreeing never to acknowledge the truth. Springfield is very good at this cost benefit calculation. The episode is not a betrayal of the show's internal logic. It's the show letting you watch, in real time and in explicit detail, a process that has been running in the background of every episode since the beginning. Springfield has always chosen comfortable lies over costly truths. The dome comes down and the town forgets. Burns almost poisons them and the town moves on. Homer causes nuclear incidents and keeps his job. The three-eyed fish appears in the water supply and nobody tests the river. Every catastrophe is absorbed. Every truth that would require action is quietly set aside. The Skinner episode is the only time the show made the mechanism visible, showed you the vote, showed you the decree, showed you the exile of the one honest man. The real Seymour Skinner is still out there somewhere. He showed up with proof that the community's official narrative was built on a lie. He was tied to a train and removed from the community for doing so. He is the last honest man in a town that made honesty illegal. And he's not a tragic figure in the show's framing. He's an inconvenience that was processed and discarded. Mo Sislak. The show has given Mo more backstory detail than almost any other non-main character, and that backstory assembles across different episodes told in completely different registers into a portrait of a person who might be the most genuinely damaged adult in Springfield. Mo was a child actor. Specifically, he played a character called Punchy on a kids show called The Happy Little Elves. The show aired, Mo was in it, and then at some point the show ended, and Mo's child acting career ended with it. The show never specifies what happened in the transition from that child to this adult, but the gap between Punchy, the cheerful children's entertainer, and Mo Sislak, the perpetually miserable bartender, suggests something significant occurred in the interval. Mo's appearance is a running thread in the show's comedy. He is consistently described as extremely unattractive, a description that the show's own visual style doesn't necessarily support, but that every character in Springfield treats as established fact. Mo has internalized this. He describes himself as ugly with a consistency that has crossed from self-deprecating humor into something that looks more like a genuine fixed belief about his own worth. He is lonely in a way that the show keeps returning to. His romantic pursuits have consistently failed, and the failure pattern isn't simply bad luck. It's a specific combination of desperation, poor social judgment, and a fundamental uncertainty about whether he deserves the things he wants that sabotages every potential connection before it can form. Mo is a man who wants love and can't sustain the circumstances that would allow him to receive it, and who has built his entire adult life around a bar that gives him daily proximity to the people he considers friends while keeping him technically in a service role that prevents the relationship from being fully reciprocal. Homer, Lenny, and Carl drink at Moe's because Moe's is where they drink. They're loyal customers. They're fond of Moe in a casual, unexamined way. Moe would die for any of them, and this disproportion, the gap between what Moe would give and what he actually receives, is one of the show's most persistent quiet cruelties. The suicide phone gags that appear throughout this series are one of the most uncomfortable recurring bits the show has. Mo answers the phone, expects a prank caller, gets information that makes him believe he has options or reasons for hope, and the episode cuts away. The show plays this for dark comedy, but accumulated over dozens of instances across the series, the pattern establishes something about Moe's baseline state that the comedy label doesn't fully contain. Moe's bar has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times. His romantic relationships have ended in ways that range from sad to catastrophic. He has been, at various points, a professional boxer, a gourmet chef, a recipient of unexpected fortune, and a nationally recognized artist, and every single one of these alternate identities has been temporary. Every time Mo finds something that looks like it might be a different life, the something dissolves. He returns to the bar, he returns to the stool, the rag, the phone, the waiting. The radiation theory, If you apply it to Mo, it does something specific. If Springfield's environment has degraded cognitive function across the population, what does that mean for someone who is already carrying the weight of a life full of failed transitions and accumulated disappointment? The the show presence, might not be the Mo who would have existed without decades of exposure to whatever's in Springfield's water. The despair might be amplified, the social judgment might be impaired, the capacity to break the patterns that keep him stuck might be exactly the capacity that's been most affected. This doesn't make Mo a tragedy in the simple sense. He's funny. The show makes him genuinely funny, often by leaning into his misery in ways that the character himself seems to participate in with a certain dark humor about his own situation. But the darkness is there, and the show knows it's there and returns to it with a frequency that suggests it considers Moe's suffering to be part of the show's statement about Springfield rather than just a convenient comedic register. Sideshow Bob. Sideshow Bob is the only Springfield villain who operates with genuine theatrical flair. He is educated, eloquent, cultured, and consumed by a specific and entirely personal obsession with the destruction of Bart Simpson. He has attempted to kill Bart multiple times. He has been convicted multiple times. He has escaped or been paroled and returned to Springfield with new elaborate plans. The cycle has been running for 36 years with no resolution in sight. The surface reading of Sideshow Bob is a comedy version of a classic arch nemesis. He's a Wile E. Coyote figure, consistently foiled by the very incompetence of his own plans or by the intervention of Bart's family, or by factors entirely outside anyone's control. The rake gag, in which Bob silently steps on rake after rake and takes each impact directly to the face, is one of the show's most beloved extended jokes. Bob is comedy. But the show has also given Bob an interior life that the comedy register doesn't quite contain. He's genuinely intelligent. The show has been consistent about this, and it's not ironic. He has real aesthetic convictions. He cares about opera, about literature, about the kinds of cultural expressions that nobody else in Springfield has any interest in. He is, in the most specific sense possible, completely wrong for his environment. He belongs, aesthetically and intellectually, somewhere else. And the somewhere else he belongs keeps failing to want him in the way he wants to be wanted. The most interesting thing about Sideshow Bob is the episode in which he successfully kills Bart, achieves the goal that has organized his entire adult life, and then immediately resurrects him because he has no idea what to do with himself in a world where Bart is dead. The episode is played as a time loop comedy, but the underlying beat is profoundly revealing. Bob's obsession with Bart isn't really about Bart. Bart is the structure around which Bob has built his entire post-crusty identity. Without Bart to pursue, without the scheme and the capture and the courtroom speech and the next plan, Bob has nothing. He's emptied himself into the pursuit, and the pursuit is all he is. This is the show's most direct engagement with what obsession does to a person. Bob is brilliant and educated and capable of things almost nobody in Springfield can manage. And he has spent all of that on a vendetta against a 10-year-old boy. The comedy is real. The waste is also real. Chief Wiggum. Clancy Wiggum is, within the show's universe, the senior law enforcement official for an entire town. He is also, by almost any assessment of his professional conduct, one of the most catastrophically incompetent public servants in the history of fiction. He has closed cases incorrectly. He has arrested innocent people. He has failed to investigate actual crimes while actively pursuing non-crimes with misplaced enthusiasm. He has, on multiple occasions, been bribed in different positions on active investigations. He falls asleep on duty, he misidentifies criminals, he loses evidence, he misinterprets evidence he successfully retains. The Who Shot Mr. Burns' case demonstrated his investigative capability in concentrated form. He nearly convicted Homer based on evidence that pointed toward Homer, partly because pointing it toward Homer was the most convenient available narrative, and partly because Wiggum doesn't possess the investigative sophistication to distinguish between evidence that points somewhere and evidence that establishes something. Under the radiation theory, Wiggum's incompetence is less individual failure and more environmental outcome. If Springfield's contamination has degraded cognitive function across the population, law enforcement is not exempt. The people tasked with investigating Springfield's crimes are the same people drinking Springfield's water and breathing Springfield's air. Wiggum's inability to identify obvious perpetrators or follow obvious leads might not be a character flaw. It might be a symptom of the same exposure that gives Homer a skull that defies human anatomy, which, if true, means that Burns's plant doesn't just poison the population. It also guarantees that the institution responsible for detecting and responding to criminal activity in the town is staffed by people whose capacity for detection and response has been systematically reduced. The plant ensures its own legal immunity through the very contamination it produces. Hans Moleman stated his age in one episode as 31 years old. 31, look at him. He appears to be in his 80s or 90s, a tiny, fragile, nearly blind man who exists primarily to be injured and killed with extraordinary frequency. By conservative estimate, Moleman has died more times than any other character in the history of American animation. He has been hit by cars, crushed by objects, eaten by animals, struck by lightning, buried alive, incinerated. He walks into traffic regularly. He disappears under wheels and between disasters and then reappears in the next episode, completely intact and apparently unaware that he died recently. If Molman is telling the truth about his age, and there's no narrative reason provided to doubt him, something has aged him catastrophically. Something has taken a man in his early 30s and produced a body that looks 60 years older. And whatever that same something is, it's also made him functionally indestructible despite his apparent fragility. He dies constantly and returns constantly. Death in Springfield, for Molman specifically, is a revolving door. The radiation theory is the most complete explanation for this. If Burns's plant has altered human biology in ways that have affected aging, immune response, cognitive function, and physical resilience across the town's population, Molman might represent an extreme expression of those alterations, specifically accelerated visible aging combined with a regenerative capacity that prevents his deaths from being permanent. His body looks ancient because something in the contamination drove his visible aging process at an accelerated rate. His body keeps returning because the same alteration that aged him also modified his cellular architecture in ways that make death impermanent. Molman once tried to make a film. It was destroyed during a mishap that involved Barney Gumble. It was his life's work. The show spent about 30 seconds on this and moved on. But the detail stays because it's the one moment the show gives Molman an interior life beyond his function as a comedic casualty. He had a passion. He had something he was making, and it was taken from him without ceremony or consequence. Springfield's background characters are full of these moments, flashes of interior life, glimpses of a person beneath the comedic function, and then back to the joke. The show knows these people are more than their gags. It just visits that knowledge briefly and returns to the surface. Section 10. The floating timeline and the loop that won't break. We've spent a significant amount of time in Springfield now. We've looked at its contaminated water and its impossible geography and its billionaire who should have died decades ago. We've examined the coma theory and the shooting mystery and the children who've been frozen in amber since 1989. And all of these threads keep arriving at the same place. Time doesn't work in Springfield, not in the way it works everywhere else, not in the way it works for the audience watching the show. In Springfield, time passes and nothing changes. Decades accumulate and the characters remain fixed. The world around them evolves, the technology, the cultural references, the political landscape, and the Simpsons themselves stay exactly who they were when the show began. The industry term for this is a floating timeline. It means the show's present is always the viewer's present. When an episode airs in 1995, the characters are living in 1995. When one airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. The year changes, the setting updates, but the ages don't. Homer and Marge are still in their mid-30s. Bart is still 10. Lisa is still 8. Maggie is still 1. The family is frozen at the ages they were at the show's debut and will presumably remain frozen there for as long as the show continues. For most of the show's history, this was simply accepted. It's how animated shows work. It's the standard approach. Family Guy does it. American Dad does it. Bob's Burgers does it. The audience understands the convention and doesn't question it because questioning it would undermine the premise of the show they're watching. But The Simpsons has been running long enough that the floating timeline has created contradictions so massive and so bizarre that they've begun to crack the foundation of the show's reality in ways that purely narrative explanations can't fully address. The most visible problem is Homer and Marge's origin story. When the show began, their history was anchored in the 1970s and early 1980s. They met in high school during that era. Their courtship had era-specific texture. The music, the fashion, the cultural references all placed their formative years in a specific, recognizable period. This made sense for a couple who were in their mid-30s in 1989. As the floating timeline moved the present forward, The backstory had to move with it. If Homer and Marge are still in their mid 30s in 2025, they couldn't have met in 1979. They'd have to have met around 2005, which means their high school experiences wasn't defined by Watergate and disco and the cultural upheavals of the Vietnam era. It was defined by MySpace and early YouTube. The show has addressed this directly in the way it addresses most uncomfortable continuities, by rewriting them. In later flashback episodes, Homer and Marge's youth has been repositioned in different decades. Their origins story has been told and retold at least 4 times, each version placing their formative years in a different era to remain plausible for a couple of their apparent ages in the show's current present. They've been depicted as counterculture hippies, as grunge era 20 somethings, as early 2000s young adults. The love story remains constant. The era keeps sliding. This means Homer and Marge don't have a stable past. Their history is a draft that gets revised every few years to maintain the illusion of the permanent present. Their memories are, within the show's internal reality, unstable. What they remember about their own lives depends on which episode you're watching and when that episode was made. Under the coma theory, this instability is expected and explained. Homer's dreaming brain doesn't have access to accurate long-term memory. It constructs the past from whatever fragments are available, and those fragments are organized around emotional truth rather than chronological fact. Of course, the backstory keeps changing. The unconscious mind doesn't maintain a consistent archive. It generates what it needs for the current moment and revises it when the current moment changes. Under the radiation theory, the instability of the timeline is another symptom of neurological damage. A population whose capacity for collective memory has been compromised by chronic exposure to radioactive contamination would be expected to have an unreliable relationship with its own history. The town forgets catastrophes. The characters forget their own backstory. The past is not a stable record, but a fluid resource that gets drawn on and reshaped as needed because the cognitive infrastructure required to maintain a consistent historical record has been degraded. Under the Skinner episode's collective denial framework, the unstable timeline is the community's deliberate choice. Springfield doesn't just forget, it decides to forget, it votes to forget. And when the past is something that's managed rather than remembered, its content is always subject to revision based on present needs. Every theory we've discussed arrives at this same point through its own root. The coma says the timeline is unstable because a dreaming brain can't maintain historical consistency. The radiation says the timeline is unstable because the population's memory is damaged. The collective denial says the timeline is unstable because the community has decided that consistency is less valuable than convenience. The Burns immortality says at least one person in this town has already broken the relationship between age and time, so why should the concept of consistent temporal progression apply to anyone else? The show has demonstrated that it can age its characters. It's done it multiple times in flash forward episodes that are among the most emotionally affecting things the series has produced. Lisa's wedding, from season 6, flashes forward and shows Lisa as a young adult, engaged and struggling with the same loneliness that defines her childhood, now wearing different clothes in a more sophisticated context, but recognizably the same person. The future version of Lisa is heartbreaking in a specific way. She has grown, she has achieved, and she is still alone. The episode proves the show knows exactly who these characters would become if time were allowed to operate normally. But the flash forward is a one-time event, a window that opens briefly and then closes. Lisa returns to 8. Bart returns to 10. The future is acknowledged and then locked away. The show imagines growth. The show refuses to allow growth. And this refusal is not a failure of imagination or nerve. It's a deliberate choice, and that choice has its own logic. Aging means ending. If Bart turns 11, the show has begun its final act. If Lisa goes to college, the family's center shifts in ways the premise can't absorb. If Maggie learns to talk, the specific mystery of her silence dissolves. If Homer retires and Marge is left in an empty house and Burns finally runs out of treatments, the show isn't a comedy anymore, it's an elegy. And nobody came to The Simpsons for an elegy. The audience needs The Simpsons to stay who they are. Not because the audience is unsophisticated, because The Simpsons have been, for 36 years, a specific kind of anchor. The world changes, the show doesn't. The characters age, the family doesn't. You can turn on an old episode from 1994 and find that Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa are exactly who you remember, dealing with something that, despite the dated references, feels immediately recognizable. The consistency of the Simpsons family is a form of stability that the audience has come to depend on in a way that most entertainment doesn't create. This is the loop. And the loop isn't their prison, it's ours. We built it, we maintain it. Every time we watch, every time we quote an episode, every time we share a clip that captures something true about our lives, we tighten the loop a little more. We make it a little harder for the Simpsons to escape. Because if they escape, if the timeline stops floating and starts landing, if Bart turns 11 and Lisa turns 9 and Maggie finally speaks her second word, then the show ends. And the show ending means admitting something we'd rather not admit. That 36 years have passed, that we're older, that the world we watched the show from, that couch in childhood or early adulthood, is gone or changed or occupied by someone else now. And as long as The Simpsons runs, as long as the loop holds, we don't have to admit that. We can sit down and turn on the television and go back to Evergreen Terrace. The family is always there. The town is always there. Homer is always stumbling through the door after another day at the plant. The couch gag plays. The theme music swells. The floating timeline isn't a production convenience. It's a deal the audience made with the show and the show made with the audience, and both sides have been honoring it for 36 years. The characters don't age because aging means goodbye, and the audience isn't ready to say goodbye, so the loop holds. The present floats, and Springfield remains as it has always remained, exactly where we left it. Section 11, Hidden Details, Background Gags, and the Secret Language of Springfield. Everything we've discussed so far has operated at the level of theory and theme and narrative. But The Simpsons has a parallel track of communication running through its visual layer that most viewers process without consciously registering, and the details hiding in that layer are in some ways the most honest things the show has ever said. The chalkboard gags in the opening credits are one of the show's oldest and most celebrated bits of recurring business. Every episode begins with Bart writing a line on the classroom chalkboard, repeated endlessly as punishment. The line changes with each episode. The chalkboard itself is just background noise to most viewers, something that plays while you're settling in, a piece of familiar texture in the opening sequence. But the chalkboard lines are also, taken together, one of the most consistent running commentaries on the show's current relationship with its audience, its production staff, and its cultural moment. Early chalkboard lines were simple rebellious declarations: I will not waste chalk, or I will not carve gods. As the show aged, the chalkboard lines became more self referential, more specifically responsive to what was happening around the show at any given moment. They acknowledged fan criticism, they referenced real events, they made jokes that only worked if you'd been watching long enough to understand the callbacks being invoked. The chalkboard is Bart's voice, technically. In practice, it's the writer's voice. The place where the show's comments directly on itself with a brevity and honesty that the episode format doesn't permit. When the show is doing well, the chalkboard reflects that. When the show is under pressure, from critics, from declining ratings, from internal conflict, the chalkboard often references it obliquely in ways that land differently, depending on how much context you bring to screening. The couch gags are the other major recurring format in the opening credits, and they've evolved over 36 years from simple variations on a single joke into elaborate miniature films with their own visual language and, in some cases, deeper meaning than the episode they're attached to. Guest animators have produced couch gags that are fully autonomous artistic statements. The Don Hertzfeldt couch gag, the Banksy-directed version, the various internationally animated versions, these are not simply promotional exercises. They're the show using the format to say things about itself, about animation, about the passage of time, that the episodes themselves aren't structured to accommodate. The Banksy couch gag deserves specific attention. Directed by Banksy and aired in 2010, it depicted a grim factory in Southeast Asia producing Simpsons merchandise. Stuffed animals and DVDs assembled by workers in conditions that the imagery made deliberately unflattering, with a kitten used to thread tape through DVD packaging holes and a unicorn used as a hole punch. The sequence ends with a Fox logo. The show allowed a world-famous street artist to use its opening credits to depict the global supply chain behind its own merchandise as an exploitative nightmare. And then the episode started, and it was a normal episode of The Simpsons. The Banksy couch gag is the most direct act of corporate self-criticism in television history. The show that owns the merchandise, produced by the network that profits from it, used its most viewed segment to depict the human cost of producing that merchandise. And it aired, and people watched, and then life continued. This is a version of something the show does constantly in its visual layer. Acknowledge uncomfortable truths and then move on without making the acknowledgement comfortable or actionable. The three-eyed fish appeared in season 2. The show acknowledged it as evidence of environmental contamination and then continued. The skeletons in the nuclear plant basement appeared in an inspection scene. The show noted their existence and continued. The Banksy couch gag ran, and the episode started. The acknowledgement is always present, the follow through is always absent. Within the show's visual grammar, this pattern is everywhere once you've identified it. The environmental contamination that the radiation theory describes is visible in the background of almost every establishing shot of Springfield. The power plant is on the horizon. The river near the town shows occasional discoloration. The wildlife in background shots includes animals that demonstrate the same physical distortions as the human characters. The show puts the evidence of its own central thesis into the visual texture of every scene and trusts the audience to either notice or not notice, and to do what Springfield does with inconvenient visual information. Look slightly past it and continue with the day. The background characters of Springfield have received increasing attention from dedicated viewers over the decades, and several of them have accumulated enough incidental detail to support their own full character analyses. We've discussed Hans Moleman, but there's also Disco Stu, whose entire characterization, the disco suits, the platform shoes, the absolute commitment to a musical era that had already passed by the time the show debuted, reads as a man who stopped processing cultural time at a specific moment and has been living inside that stopped moment ever since. Under the coma theory or the collective denial theory, Disco Stew is the visual embodiment of Springfield's relationship with the past. Frozen in a specific cultural moment, unable or unwilling to update, entirely sincere in his commitment to the outdated. Professor Franks, Springfield's resident scientist, has demonstrated across multiple episodes an ability to invent technology that should, if functional as described, transform the world entirely. He has produced devices with genuine revolutionary potential, technologies that in a functioning society would be immediately recognized, developed, and deployed at scale. In Springfield, his inventions are deployed in a single episode, produce comedic consequences, and are never heard from again. The show uses Frink as a comedy resource, and in doing so makes a quiet observation about what happens to innovation in a community that lacks the institutional framework to nurture it. Every breakthrough Frink achieves disappears into Springfield's episodic amnesia. The technology that could have changed everything is always one scene away from being forgotten. The Quickie Mart and Apu are a separate discussion that the show itself has had and has handled with varying degrees of grace depending on the season and the cultural moment. What's worth noting in this context is that the Quickie Mart functions as one of the show's most consistent settings, a site of community exchange that operates outside the social hierarchies that define most of Springfield's other institutions. In a town where Burns controls the power plant and Skinner controls the school and Wiggum controls law enforcement and the church is always open, but God never answers, the Quickie Mart is where people of every social position interact without those positions being the primary organizing principle of the interaction. Homer goes to the Quickie Mart for donuts and beer and is served the same as Burns would be served. The town meeting in Who Shot Mr. Burns begins with people gathering, and many of them pass through the Quickie Mart on the way. The Springfield Mall and its various shops, the retirement castle where Grandpa lives, the Springfield Dump where the show has sent characters for both comedic and genuinely affecting episodes. These places collectively constitute a geography of the town's social strata. Burns lives on a hilltop that physically positions him above the town he owns. The Simpsons live in a house that is solidly average by Springfield's median standard. Retirement Castle is a holding facility for the old in a town that has no particular use for age. The dump is where things go that have been categorized as without further value. The visual positioning of these spaces relative to each other encodes the show's understanding of Springfield's social structure as clearly as any dialogue. You can read the power map of Springfield from its geography without any character telling you who matters and who doesn't. The Treehouse of Horror episodes deserve their own consideration. For 35 years, the show has produced Halloween specials that exist in a formally acknowledged alternate universe. Stories that are explicitly designated as non-canonical, as horror fables rather than regular episodes. Characters die in Treehouse of Horror. Rules that apply in the regular show are suspended. The show's normal constraints on consequence and darkness are relaxed. But the Treehouse of Horror episodes have also consistently been some of the show's most honest engagements with its own themes. The horror format allows the show to say things directly that the comedy format requires it to say obliquely. The Treehouse episodes in which Springfield faces actual annihilation, in which Homer actually dies and stays dead, in which Burns exercises the kind of direct destructive power over the town that the radiation theory argues he exercises slowly and invisibly in the regular show. These episodes are the show trying on a version of its own premise that it's not allowed to fully commit to in the mainline narrative. The horror is the subtext made text. The contamination that operates silently in the background of the regular show appears in the Treehouse episodes as an explicit monster with an explicit appetite. The power structure that the regular show depicts through economic and political manipulation appears in the Treehouse episodes as an actual overlord with direct lethal authority. The show gives itself permission once a year to say without comedies what it spends the other 49 weeks encoding in background details and throwaway lines. The accumulation of these details, the chalkboard gags and the couch gags and the background characters and the visual positioning and the treehouse episodes creates a second Springfield running parallel to the one in the foreground. A Springfield that is more honest about what it is. A Springfield that doesn't reset. A Springfield where the evidence of the contamination doesn't disappear between scenes, where the bones in the basement stay on the record, where the three-eyed fish is still in the river, and someone is still asking what it means. That Springfield exists in the margins of every episode. It lives in details that are placed there, knowing most viewers won't register them consciously, trusting that something will accumulate anyway, that the picture will form in the peripheral vision even when it can't be looked at directly. The show has been building this second Springfield since the first episode and has been showing it to you every week for 36 years. It is always there, in the background, behind the jokes, underneath the couch gag, waiting for someone to look slightly past the foreground and notice what's been sitting there all along. Conclusion. Coming home, we've spent 4 hours in Springfield. We've traced the radiation from the plant through the water table and into the bodies of every resident who has ever lived there. We've followed Homer's possible coma from April 1993 through every absurd storyline that followed it and considered the possibility that every episode since that date has been the dream of a man who is trying very hard not to wake up. We've reopened the Burns shooting and found a case that has more loose threads than the official answer accounts for. We've examined the three Simpson children as people rather than character types and found that one of them might be the most strategically intelligent person in Springfield, which she has been careful to ensure nobody notices. We've looked at Burns through the framework of a man who has built a civilization-scale life support system disguised as a corporation. We've followed Mona Simpson's 30 years underground and traced the damage her absence caused across 3 generations of the same family. We've searched for Springfield on every map and found it on none of them. We've examined the predictions and found them to be a product of intelligence, volume, time, and confirmation bias rather than prophecy, while acknowledging that the distinction becomes blurry when the show is right with sufficient frequency and precision. We've looked at Ned Flanders and seen a man who has done everything right and received nothing in return from a cosmos that talks to Homer and ignores him. We've looked at the visual layer of the show and found a second Springfield hiding in plain sight, encoded in every background detail the foreground comedy gives you permission to ignore. Every one of these threads is different. Everyone draws on different episodes, different kinds of evidence, different frameworks for understanding what The Simpsons is and what it has been doing for 36 seasons. But everyone arrives at the same place. Something is wrong in Springfield. Something structural. Something that has been present since the first episode and has been accumulating ever since in the background, in the margins, in the details that the show places there, and trusts you either to find or not find. Springfield isn't hiding its mysteries. It's showing them to you every week. It's just that the display mechanism is the same one the town uses to hide them from its own residents. Normalization. You've seen the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the ageless children and the billionaire who glows in the dark so many times that they've stopped registering as remarkable. You've absorbed Springfield's impossible geography and its recurring catastrophes and its collective amnesia as simply the texture of the show, the background hum of a place you've known for most of your life. The theories exist because some people refuse to let the normalization fully take hold. They looked at the three-eyed fish and kept asking what it meant. They noticed the tonal shift in season 4 and traced it back to a specific episode. They counted Homer's confessions and examined the sundial and observed that the clue Burns himself described as accidental was being used as the cornerstone of the official explanation. They paid attention to Maggie's face and noticed that what looked like the blankness of an infant was something else entirely. And what they found in the accumulated evidence of 788 episodes is a version of Springfield that is stranger and sadder, and in its strange, sad way, more beautiful than the one on the surface. A version where Homer's limited intelligence is the scar left by a system that broke his family before he was old enough to understand what was being taken from him. A version where Maggie's silence is the most strategically sophisticated choice anyone in the family has made. A version where Burns's immortality is the logical conclusion of what it looks like when wealth becomes entirely self-referential, when money is deployed primarily to generate the conditions required to generate more money, and at some point, the person at the center of the system has been sustaining themselves on the output of that process for so long that the process and the person have become impossible to separate. A version where Marge's patience is not passive but active, not the absence of resistance, but the specific form of resistance available to a woman in her position, maintaining the stability that the family requires to function, absorbing the damage that Homer's limitations generate, keeping the house and the children and the daily texture of life intact through a sustained effort that the show depicts without always naming. Marge is the reason the family exists as a functional unit. The show knows this. The show has occasionally said it directly, and it has spent 36 years also showing you the cost. Lisa asks questions nobody wants to answer. She has been asking them since she was 8 years old, and she will keep asking them for as long as the show runs because Lisa is the character the show uses to voice its own awareness of its limitations. She can see what Springfield is. She can articulate it with precision. She cannot change it, and she cannot stop caring that she can't change it. Lisa is the show's conscience, placed inside the show and unable to act on what she knows, because acting on it would require the kind of change that the format, the audience, and the town's collective denial all prevent. Bart is the show's id, the energy and the rebellion and the refusal to accept the terms being offered, channeled into disruption rather than into any systematic alternative. Bart resists without a program. He pushes back without knowing specifically what he's pushing toward. This is not a failure. It is its own kind of faithfulness to something the show values, the refusal to accept the given world as inevitable, even when you don't have a clear vision of what should replace it. And Homer is the show. He is the character the show began with and has sustained for 36 years because Homer Simpson contains the full range of what the show is trying to do. He is genuinely funny. He is genuinely damaged. He is a better father than he appears to be, and a worse employee than Burns deserves, and a more loving husband than he probably understands himself to be. He has been broken by a system that required a broken person and repaired himself imperfectly and repeatedly because the people inside his life are worth repairing for. He will never understand the full architecture of his situation. He will never have the cognitive tools to trace the line from Burns's plant to his mother's exile to his own crayon. But he stumbles toward his family at the end of every episode, and that stumbling, that imperfect homing instinct, is the show's emotional thesis. The Simpsons is a comedy about a family that should be falling apart and keeps not falling apart. It is a satire about America that keeps being more accurate than satire should have to be. It is a puzzle with no final solution, a mystery with no resolution, a loop with no exit that we keep choosing to enter, because inside the loop, something is waiting for us that we cannot get anywhere else. The couch is always there, the theme music always plays, Homer always makes it home by the end of the episode, stumbling through the door after another day at the nuclear plant that's been poisoning his town, in the town that doesn't appear on any map, at the end of a timeline that floats in permanent suspension, 30 feet above the moment it was originally anchored to. The loop holds. Springfield waits. And somewhere in a hospital bed in a town that cannot be located, a man is dreaming about his family. His children are young. His wife is there. The house looks the same as it always did. The beer in the refrigerator is cold. That's all he ever wanted. That's all the dream has ever been about. We'll see you in Springfield. End of script. 4 hours of hidden Simpsons details, plus mysteries final. Expansion. Additional deep dives, Homer Simpson, the accidental everyman, and what that actually means. To understand Homer fully, you need to step back from the specific episodes and look at the arc of what the show has built over 36 years. because Homer Simpson began as a specific kind of social observation. The working class American father, rendered honestly and without the soft focus sentimentality that most television of the era applied to this figure, and has over time become something larger and stranger. A container for the culture's anxieties about what the ordinary American life actually looks like from the inside. The genius of Homer's initial conception was the refusal to make him aspirational. Television fathers in the 1980s were either wise and loving in a way that reinforced a particular image of family as a smoothly functioning unit, or they were bumbling idiots whose incompetence was played for laughs but was fundamentally harmless. Homer was neither of these. Homer was recognizably real in a way that made audiences simultaneously laugh and feel exposed. He was self centered without being villainous. He was loving without being competent at expressing love. He was working class without it being his defining characteristic or the subject of a special episode. He was, in short, the person in the living room, not the person the television usually put on the screen, but the person watching the television. And the show's willingness to depict that person, with all his specific contradictions and failures and moments of genuine grace, without flinching or sentimentalizing, was the original source of The Simpsons' power. Over 36 years, that power has been complicated by the show's own evolution and by the cultural changes that have occurred around it. Homer's self centeredness, which in early seasons felt like an honest portrayal of a realistic character flaw, has at various points in the show's later years been amplified into something that looks more like a stylized comedic quality, broader, less specifically human, more a platform for jokes than a genuine character note. The show has periodically lost track of the difference between Homer being Homer and Homer, performing an exaggerated version of Homer, and the loss of that distinction is one of the most commonly cited markers of decline in discussions about the show's creative arc. But even the most compromised seasons of the show have returned periodically to the version of Homer that works, the version that remembers he is genuinely damaged and genuinely loving and genuinely trapped and genuinely trying. The Homer who hangs the note on the refrigerator, the Homer who sits with his mother as she dies, the Homer who sings to Maggie in the night because she's crying and he doesn't know what else to do. These moments work because the foundation is there. 36 years of building a character means that when the show returns to what matters about him, it has the depth to land the arrival with weight. You know Homer well enough that these moments carry everything that is accumulated around him. The joke that preceded it and the joke that will follow it don't diminish the moment. They frame it. They make it visible in a way that pure sincerity without the surrounding comedy might not achieve. Homer Simpson is the longest running study of a single ordinary human being in the history of American television. That's not an overstatement. 788 episodes, 36 years, the same person processed through thousands of different situations, different challenges, different contexts, different scales of consequence. The picture that emerges from that accumulation is not a simple one. It is not the picture of a buffoon or a hero or a cautionary tale. It is the picture of someone trying imperfectly and persistently to be adequate to the life he has, in a context that has made him less capable of adequacy than he might have been, for reasons that are neither entirely his fault nor entirely outside his control. That is a more honest portrait of ordinary human experience than most art manages to produce. And the fact that it's been delivered through 36 years of animated comedy, through a format that requires the protagonist to fail and reset every episode, through a premise built on the specific absurdism of a nuclear plant and a town that glows in the dark, none of that diminishes the portrait. It might be what makes the portrait possible. You can say things in a cartoon that you can't say in a drama. You can sustain a character study for 36 years in an animated sitcom that would be intolerable in a realistic format simply because the animation and the comedy provide enough distance and enough joy that the weight doesn't become crushing. You can watch Homer suffer hundreds of consequences and keep coming back because the format resets him. And the reset feels like mercy rather than narrative cowardice because the accumulated suffering is always there in the background, even when the foreground has moved on. Homer Simpson is an art form. 36 years of one person rendered in yellow in Springfield. The show doesn't need to age him. The accumulation is already there. Marge Simpson, the character the show never fully told, Marge Simpson, is in many ways the show's most underserved character. She is the load bearing member of the family structure, the person whose consistent effort and patience and care makes it possible for the other four family members to be who they are. And the show has, for most of its run, rewarded this load-bearing function with less narrative attention than she deserves. The early seasons were better about this. Marge's storylines in seasons 2 through 5 explored her specific anxieties, her specific ambitions, her specific experiences of a life that was both genuinely her own and also in constant service to the needs of other people. The episode in which she develops a gambling addiction is one of the show's most honest portrayals of the way addictive behavior can emerge in people who appear to have it together, as a place where the person who never gets to do what they want discovers something that is entirely, completely without negotiation for them. The episode in which she considers an affair with a French bowling instructor explores the specific exhaustion of being married to Homer with a compassion for Marge's position that the comedy of Homer's obliviousness doesn't undermine. These episodes established Marge as a person with an interior life that was complex and sometimes at odds with the life she was publicly performing. The public Marge, patient, supportive, principled, slightly anxious, deeply decent, is real. But the show was wise enough in its early seasons to show you that this public Marge is also a sustained performance maintained through effort and that the effort has a cost. As the show aged, Marge's narrative function increasingly simplified. She became the voice of reason, the character who articulates the episode's moral position before the plot proves it, and the expression of anxiety, the character whose worry about whatever the episode's central conflict involves provides the emotional stakes. These are not insignificant functions, but they are functions rather than characteristics. They describe what Marge does for the episodes rather than who Marge is as a person. The most interesting thing the show has ever done with Marge is to place her in the position of someone who sees clearly and cannot act. She sees Homer's limitations with complete clarity. She sees the impact of those limitations on her children and on herself. She has, in various episodes, articulated this clearly enough that it lands as something the show is genuinely engaging with rather than deflecting. And then she stays. She makes the choice that the show has her make in every episode, the choice to maintain the family, the choice to keep Homer, the choice to apply her own discipline and intelligence and patience to the problem of making their life work. Under the radiation theory, Marge's situation is particularly interesting. She has demonstrably better judgment and cognitive function than Homer. She has demonstrably better social intelligence, emotional intelligence, and practical problem-solving ability. She is, by any reasonable measure, operating at a higher level than her husband in most domains the show depicts, and she has chosen to organize her life around him. The radiation theory would suggest that Marge, having worked at the plant herself for a period, is not exempt from contamination. But her contamination, whatever form it took, produced someone with a specific set of abilities intact and a specific set of choices available to her. Her intelligence and social function appear less compromised than Homer's. What the contamination may have affected, and this is the dark reading, is her capacity to fully act on what she understands. Marge knows things she doesn't act on. She sees patterns she doesn't address. She makes assessments that she then sets aside and continues with the daily routine that the family requires. This is, on one level, simply the practical wisdom of a parent and a partner. You cannot fight every battle, and choosing which battles to fight is a form of intelligence in itself. But it is also, if you read it through the framework of cognitive damage, consistent with a person whose analytic capacity remains intact, but whose capacity to translate understanding into sustained action has been compromised in some way. The question the show never asks directly is whether Marge is happy. Not whether she is good, or whether she is right, or whether she is doing the thing that produces the best outcomes for the people around her, whether she is happy. The show has approached this question, has gotten close enough to it that you can cease it from the approach, and has consistently deflected before landing on the question's actual answer. Because if Marge is not happy, if the life she has built and maintained with such persistent effort is not the life she would have chosen with full information and full agency, then the show is saying something specific and difficult about the structures within which the people it most admires are living. It isn't that goodness and capability are not sufficient conditions for happiness, that the system Springfield operates within consumes goodness and capability as fuel, producing stability for others, while leaving the person who provides them with something less than what they might have had. The show may not have earned the right to say this directly, given how thoroughly Marge's interiority has been marginalized across the later seasons. But the foundation is there. The early episodes built it. and everything the show has shown you about Marge. Her patience, her effort, her clarity, her consistent choice to stay and maintain is consistent with a portrait that the show has chosen not to complete. Marge Simpson is still waiting for her episode. After 36 seasons, the most interesting character in the show is still mostly visible through what she does for other people rather than who she is for herself. The recurring secondary characters as Springfield's social map, Springfield's recurring secondary characters, the people who appear in episode after episode without being central to the family's narrative, constitute, in aggregate, one of American television's most detailed depictions of a community's social structure. Think about what the secondary cast covers. You have the employer and the employer-employee relationship represented through Burns and the rest of the power plant workforce. You have the educational system through Skinner and the teachers and the Springfield elementary structure. You have law enforcement through Wiggum and his department. You have religious institution through Lovejoy and his congregation. You have economic life at the small business level through Mo, Apu, Sideshow Bob's various criminal enterprises, and dozens of other Springfield business people. You have the media through Kent Brockman and his news broadcasts. You have political life through Mayor Quimby and the various Springfield government officials. Each of these characters, through their accumulated appearances, has built a specific picture of how their respective institution operates in Springfield. And what the picture shows across all of them is a consistent pattern. Every institution in Springfield is compromised by a combination of individual failure, structural corruption, and the specific kind of collective denial that the Skinner episode made explicit. Wiggum's police department doesn't function as a deterrent to crime because Wiggum cannot maintain the level of attention required for effective law enforcement. And because the department's relationship to Burns's wealth has, in various episodes, been depicted as one of accommodation rather than independence. Lovejoy's church provides community and ritual, but has lost track of the genuine theological engagement that the town's most devout member, Ned, is seeking. Quimby's government operates on a model of continuous corruption that the show depicts so consistently and with such detail that it functions less as satire of political corruption and more as documentation of it. Brockman's media amplifies spectacle and abandons context with the precision of someone who has learned exactly what captures attention and exactly what maintaining attention costs in terms of actual information. All of these institutions are recognizable. That's the point. The Simpsons is not depicting a particularly dysfunctional town. It's depicting a typically dysfunctional town and refusing to pretend the dysfunction is exceptional. Springfield is America's institutions, rendered in the amber of a specific era and maintained in that amber through the floating timeline's refusal to age. What they looked like in 1989 is what they look like now, because the timeline doesn't move, and because the show is correctly diagnosed that the underlying dysfunctions are structural rather than situational. The institutions were compromised in 1989. They are compromised now. The specific corruptions change in detail but not in structure. The police that doesn't adequately protect the community. The government that responds to wealth and ignores need. The media that amplifies fear and avoids accountability. The religious institution that provides comfort without challenge. The educational system that sorts children by compliance rather than capability. Springfield has all of these. America has all of these. The show has been documenting the overlap for 36 years. Kent Brockman deserves specific attention here because his specific function in the show's secondary cast is the most directly meta. Brockman is the show's comment on the media, which is also the show's comment on itself. He covers Springfield's news with the same combination of manufactured urgency and fundamental curiosity that the show recognizes in real television journalism. He amplifies stories that generate emotional response and abandons them when the emotional response has been extracted. He positions himself as the community's informational resource while consistently prioritizing his own comfort and the station's ratings over the actual service that informational resource should provide. In the episode where he believed an alien invasion was occurring and immediately declared allegiance to the alien overlords, the show is making a specific joke about media personalities and the speed with which apparent commitment can collapse under pressure. But it was also making a point about what the media is, structurally, an institution whose primary commitments are to its own continuation and to the maintenance of audience attention, with public service as a secondary consideration at best. Brockman's coverage of Burns's various schemes is particularly revealing. He has documented Burns's outrages with appropriate dramatic intensity and then moved on with appropriate speed. The Blinky Fish was a major story that Brockman covered, and then the story stopped. The sun blocking device was covered until it was resolved and then forgotten. The dome in the movie would presumably have received extensive coverage if the movie's plot had allowed for any. Brockman is always there for the spectacle. He is never there for the follow up. The follow up is where the accountability would live, and the follow up is exactly what Springfield's collective denial process ensures never happens. The character of Hank Scorpio, from the season 8 episode You Only Move Twice, deserves a discussion in any deep examination of the show's secondary character ecology. Scorpio is a villain, literally a Bond villain, running a secret organization and planning world domination, who is also, in his day to day interactions, one of the most supportive and genuinely kind employers Homer has ever had. He listens to Homer. He remembers Homer's name, which Burns famously cannot. He treats Homer's professional contribution as real and valuable. He creates conditions under which Homer actually functions effectively at work. The episode uses this contrast to make a point that might be the darkest in the show's run. Homer does better under Scorpio than he does under Burns. Homer is actually capable of competent work when placed in an environment where his employer values him and remembers his name and creates conditions for his success. The catastrophic incompetence that Homer displays throughout his time at the nuclear plant is not intrinsic to Homer. It is, at least partly, a product of the specific working conditions Burns has created. Conditions that produce a Homer who cannot function, which is exactly what Burns requires. Scorpio shows you the counterfactual. This is what Homer might have been capable of if the environment had been designed to support rather than undermine him. And then the episode ends, and Homer comes back to Springfield and comes back to Burns and comes back to the plant because the family didn't want to leave. Because the family's needs matter more to Homer than his own professional development. Because Homer will sacrifice the version of his working life that actually worked for the version of his family life that he needs. It's funny, and it's sad, and it's the most compressed version of the show's central argument about Homer. He is capable of more than he typically demonstrates, but the conditions under which he lives have been designed to prevent that capability from emerging, and his own priorities ensure that he will always return to those conditions rather than pursuing the environments that would support his growth. The Hank Scorpio episode is the show admitting, in the most compressed way possible, what it has been building toward across its entire run. The show's relationship with its own legacy, The Simpsons, has been on the air for long enough that it has outlasted most of the cultural contexts that initially gave it meaning. The debates of the early 1990s about whether the show was as appropriate for children, whether it was too cynical, whether it was undermining family values. These are so thoroughly over that they're now historical curiosities. The cultural positions the show initially occupied as a provocateur have long since been absorbed. The Simpsons is now an institution. It is one of the things that American culture has decided to maintain. This creates a specific artistic challenge. The show that was originally transgressive because of what it said about American family life is now part of the institutional furniture of American family life. The show that was a provocation has become a comfort. The edge that made it sharp in 1990 has been worn down not by the show becoming less honest, but by the culture incorporating its honesty and building around it. The show is aware of this. It has been navigating it with varying degrees of success for 20 plus years. The late era meta commentary, the self referential jokes about the show's longevity and decline and cultural position, are the production team's way of engaging with the challenge, make something that was once novel in a world where the novelty is long gone. The best of these meta moments, the ones that acknowledge the situation honestly without becoming either defensive or sentimental. The Simpsons has earned the right to say it has been around long enough to see its own impact on the culture. It has earned the right to note with appropriate wryness that the show would once scandalize parents is now the show those parents put on for their children as a comfort object. It has earned the right to recognize that Springfield has become a real place in the cultural imagination of the people who grew up with it, as real as any place they actually visited, more real in some ways, because the visits to Springfield were so frequent, and the Springfield they visited was so consistent. What the show cannot do, and what its best moments in its later years have recognized it cannot do, is claim the same urgency it had when it was new. The urgency was real and earned and specific to a moment. That moment is past. The show that remains is something different, a legacy work, a sustained exercise in maintenance, an ongoing demonstration that a thing can continue after its original reason for existing has been superseded without thereby becoming worthless. The Simpsons at 36 is not the same as The Simpsons at 6. Both are real. Neither cancels the other. The show at 6 was about something that needed saying in a specific moment. The show at 36 is about something different, about duration, about the relationship between a work and its audience across time, about what it means to have been present for 36 years in the living room of the culture and to still be there, still recognizable, still capable of the occasional moment that reminds you of why you started watching. The most honest assessment of The Simpsons as a whole is that it is one of the longest and most ambitious sustained studies of a specific human environment in the history of storytelling. Not because every episode is brilliant, many are not. Not because the show has maintained consistent quality across its run, it has not. But because the accumulated picture, the entire run, represents something that doesn't have a parallel 36 years of a single specific community, rendered through animation and comedy, tracked through every kind of change and stasis that a community can experience, examined through every lens available to the medium. We have spent more time in Springfield than in any other fictional place. We know it better than we know many real places. We have watched it change and refuse to change and change without acknowledging the change and maintain itself against forces that should have altered it permanently. We have watched its people grow without aging and fail without consequence and succeed without security and love without understanding what they're doing. We have watched the plant keep running and the fish stay three-eyed and the timeline keep floating and the family keep being at the couch by the credits. We have watched Springfield be exactly what Springfield is, which is exactly what the show always promised to show us. An impossible town, populated by impossible people, doing possible things in impossible ways, in a loop that started before many of its current viewers were born and shows no sign of stopping. Every theory we've examined is an attempt to explain why Springfield is the way it is. The radiation, the coma, the cover up, the immortal billionaire, the strategic silence, the collective denial, all of them are trying to give structure to the experience of watching 36 years of a show that has refused to be limited by the logic that most shows operate within. And maybe the simplest version of the answer is this: Springfield is the way it is because it's a dream. Not Homer's specific coma dream, though that reading has its own beautiful consistency. But the dream that the show's creators had in 1989 about a town that would be real enough to carry everything they wanted to put inside it, and the dream that the audience has maintained by continuing to watch, by continuing to return to Evergreen Terrace, by continuing to accept the yellow skin and the four fingers and the ageless children as the price of admission to the place the show offers. Springfield is a collective dream, dreamed initially by a small group of writers and animators in the late 1980s, maintained, expanded, complicated, and refined across 36 years by everyone who has made the show and everyone who has watched it. A dream specific enough to have geography and economics and politics, persistent enough to have survived the deaths of some of its creators and the departure of others and the loss of its initial audience to time, real enough to have shaped the cultural imagination of people who have never visited Oregon, who don't live near nuclear plants, who couldn't tell you what Sector 7G is. Homer is still at the plant. The fish still has three eyes. The couch gag still plays. We'll see you next episode. We always do. End of final expansion content bonus section. The show within the show, Krusty the Media Landscape, and what entertainment does to Springfield Krusty the Clown has been on Springfield. Television for as long as anyone can remember. He predates the show's current timeline in the sense that Bart grew up watching Krusty, which means Krusty's career was established and running before any of the episodes we've discussed took place. He is Springfield's most visible media figure, its dominant entertainer, the person whose face appears on more merchandise than anyone else in town. And Krusty is miserable. This is not subtext. The show has made Krusty's misery explicit across dozens of episodes, through direct dialogue, through behavioral patterns, through the specific texture of his off-camera life, and through the fundamental contrast between his public persona. Krusty the Clown, beloved entertainer, friend to children, a figure of joy and chaos and rubber chickens, and who he actually is, which is a deeply alienated man who cannot connect the work he does to any sense of personal meaning. The show uses Krusty to examine something specific about the entertainment industry and about what the production of mass joy does to the person producing it. Krusty has made millions of children happy. He has been a central feature of Springfield's childhood for generations. His work has genuine value by the measure of what it provides to the people who receive it. And none of this has given Krusty any particular happiness in return, because the transaction has always been one directional. He gives joy. He doesn't receive it. The audience gets the clown. Krusty gets the smoking and the gambling and the debt and the cynicism that has accumulated around a career he entered for reasons that the show has depicted as genuine. He wanted to be a comedian. He wanted to make people laugh, and that has become, through success and time, a machine he operates rather than a thing he loves. The estrangement between Krusty and his father, the rabbi, is the show's deepest exploration of this dynamic. Krusty's father disapproved of comedy as a profession. Krusty pursued it anyway as an act of generational rebellion and genuine desire. His father cut contact, and Krusty became famous and successful and completely unable to enjoy, either because the person he most wanted to share the success with had disowned it. He kept doing the work. He got better at it. The audience grew. His father remained absent. And the success, without the recognition that would have made it meaningful, produced exactly the psychological profile the show has given Krusty. A man who can perform joy with complete professionalism and feel none of it. The episode in which Bart and Lisa help Krusty reconnect with his father, like Father Like Clown, is one of the show's most genuinely affecting episodes, and it works because of everything the show has built around Krusty up to that point. The reconciliation scene lands because you've watched Krusty's emptiness for long enough to understand how much the reconnection means. And then Krusty goes back to his show. He keeps performing. The reconciliation makes him slightly less miserable. Slightly. The structural conditions of his life haven't changed. His father's acceptance doesn't transform his relationship to the work or give the success the meaning it always lacked. Krusty keeps going because Krusty always keeps going. That's his character. That's also what the show is saying about the entertainment industry, about the specific kind of person it produces and consumes and discards, about what it looks like when someone devotes their life to making other people feel something and cannot access that feeling themselves. Sideshow Bob's original relationship to the Krusty Show is worth examining here because it creates an interesting contrast. Sideshow Bob, Kelsey Grammer's voice immediately distinguishable, the character's erudition entirely incongruous with his role as Krusty's sidekick, was explicitly a gifted person forced into a subordinate position that humiliated him daily. His resentment of this position was the direct cause of his first crime. He framed Krusty for armed robbery to take over the show because the show offered visibility and audience and a platform that his role as a background figure denied him. Bob's subsequent criminal career is, from a certain angle, the story of a highly capable person who made the mistake of letting his resentment of an unjust situation drive him towards solutions that were worse than the situations itself. He was right that his position was beneath him. He was wrong about what to do about it. And every scheme since has been shaped by the same pattern. The intelligence and capability operating in service of impulses that prevent them from producing anything constructive. Bob is Springfield's most articulate character. He speaks more precisely and more beautifully than anyone else in the show's cast. He has genuine aesthetic convictions. He has read things and remembered them. He is capable of sustained strategic thinking at a level that the other characters in Springfield cannot approach. And all of this is organized since his original crime around a vendetta against a 10-year-old boy, which is the most precise possible symbol for the colossal misalignment between Bob's capability and the use to which it has been put. The show has occasionally let Bob out of the Bart vendetta loop and given him space to be something else. These episodes are often the most interesting side-eyed show Bob episodes because they show you what he is without the organizing's obsession. He's still a person who makes bad decisions, but the decisions are different when they're not all in service of the same narrow goal. This episode in which Bob achieves political office, the episode in which he succeeds in killing Bart only to bring him back because life without the pursuit is meaningless. These are moments the show uses to say something about what obsession costs and what it hides. Krusty and Bob together constitute the show's fullest examination of the entertainment industry and what it does to people. Krusty is what success without meaning looks like. Bob is what talent without constructive outlet looks like. One performed his way to the top and found it hollow. The other was prevented from reaching the top and made the prevention his defining story. Springfield's entertainment landscape has produced in its two most prominent figures a study in the specific miseries available to gifted people in a system that doesn't adequately connect talent to fulfillment. The specific genius of the show's comedy writing and why it matters. There is a version of this conversation that focuses entirely on the darkness, the contamination, the coma, the conspiracy. And that version is real, and the evidence for it is there. But it would be incomplete without acknowledging what makes The Simpsons worth spending 4 hours investigating in the first place. The comedy writing at its peak is, by any honest assessment, among the best writing in the history of American television. Not just animated television. Television. The density of ideas, the precision of the jokes, the way the best episodes layer comedy with genuine emotional weight so that the laugh and the feeling arrive together rather than in sequence. This is craft at a level that very few creative endeavors in any medium achieve. The density is worth examining specifically. A great Simpsons joke, from the show's golden era in particular, operates simultaneously on multiple registers. There's the surface joke, which is funny by itself. There's the character joke underneath it, which adds a layer of recognition for viewers who know these characters well. There's sometimes a cultural reference operating sideways through the scene, and underneath all of these is often a structural joke about the situation itself, about the form, about the conventions of television or storytelling or comedy that the show is playing with. When these layers all land simultaneously, the result is something more than funny. It's the feeling of a mind working at full capacity, using every available tool to say as many true things as possible in the space of a single joke. This is what the show's critics mean when they describe a period when the show was operating at a level it subsequently lost. They're describing the experience of encountering writing that was using the entire range of what comedy could do rather than a portion of it. The decline that fans discuss is real in the sense that this specific density became less consistent over time. The show still produced great jokes. It still produced great episodes. But the consistent achievement of that specific density, every element working, every layer landing, the comedy and the emotion and the cultural observation all arriving together became rarer. Understanding why this happened is less interesting than understanding why it was possible in the first place. The combination of writers with extraordinary formal education and genuine satirical vision, a network that was willing to let the show take formal risks, a production team that understood animation as a medium with specific expressive possibilities rather than as a cheaper substitute for live action, and a cultural moment in which the show's specific targets, the corruption of American institutions, the gap between the country's self-image and its reality, the specific texture of working class family life, were subjects that the rest of television was largely avoiding. The golden era of The Simpsons is, among other things, what happens when that specific combination of talent and context and subject matter and formal possibility all come together. It's not replicable. The combination was specific to its moment. But understanding it is understanding something about why great art happens, not as a result of any single factor, but as a convergence of multiple factors that individually wouldn't be sufficient. The show's comedy writing also embedded the theories we've been discussing throughout this video. The radiation jokes, the coma's prerequisite event, the Burns immortality gags, the Skinner revelation, these were all written as comedy. They work as comedy. And they also work as something else simultaneously because the comedy writing was good enough to hold both registers at once. You could laugh at the three-eyed fish and also feel the implication of the three-eyed fish. You could laugh at Homer's incompetence at the nuclear plant and also feel the horror of what that incompetence represents. You could laugh at Burns's impossibly preserved existence and also feel the specific terror of wealth that has made itself immune to consequence. The comedy was always the vehicle. The comedy was always carrying something heavier. The theories exist because the writing was dense enough to support them. Because the jokes contained enough information about Springfield's actual nature that pulled out and examined, they form a coherent picture of something the comedy format required to remain at the level of implication. What we've spent 4 hours doing in this video is making that implications explicit. The show put the evidence in the comedy and trusted the audience to either find it or not. This video is the finding, the ending that will never come, and why that's the point The Simpsons will end someday. This is true despite all available evidence to the contrary. The show has been renewed through 2026 as of the most recent confirmation, which represents a continuation into its 38th season. There is no obvious endpoint on the horizon. The show's production infrastructure is intact, its audience remains sufficient, and the institutional relationships that sustain it show no signs of dissolving. But the show will end. Every show ends. And the question of how The Simpsons should or will or might end is one that the show itself has addressed in various ways without ever committing to an answer. The flash forward episodes, Lisa's wedding, the various future set treehouse of horror segments have shown you the show's imagination of its own characters' futures. These imagined futures are not optimistic. Lisa is still lonely. Bart is still aimless. Homer is still struggling with the same limitations he's always had. Marge is still holding the family together. The futures the show imagines for its characters are continuous with who those characters are, which means they're carrying the same wounds forward. The most honest version of The Simpsons' ending would be the show acknowledging, directly and without comedy, that the loop has been the point all along. That what it has been doing for 36 years is not failing to tell a story with an ending, but telling the story of a family that exists in the space before the ending, preserved in the specific quality of ongoing life that doesn't resolve. Families don't resolve. Families continue, and the continuation is the story, and the story has no conclusion except the ones that are imposed from outside by mortality or separation or the decision to stop paying attention. The loop isn't a failure to end. The loop is the accurate representation of what family life actually is. The Simpsons will end when someone decides to end it. Before that decision is made, the family keeps going. Homer goes to the plant. Bart goes to school. Lisa plays saxophone. Maggie watches. Marge holds it together. Every episode is the middle of a story that started before it began and continues after it ends. Every ending is provisional. Every reset is the show acknowledging that the story isn't over because the family isn't over. And the families isn't over because we haven't let it be over. The show ends when we stop watching. Until then, it's Sunday night at 8. The couch is waiting, and Springfield is exactly where we left it. The show's treatment of class and economics. What Homer's job really represents the nuclear power plant is not just a sense, it is the show's central economic argument rendered in concrete form. Homer Simpson earns a wage at the nuclear power plant. That wage supports a house, a car, a family of 5, and a lifestyle that, while not luxurious, is recognizably middle-class American. He has a yard, he has a basement, he has a television and a refrigerator stocked with food and an occasional vacation, and enough left over for donuts. This is the show's picture of what a unionized working-class job in America provided in 1989, and, through the floating timeline, is presented as still providing today. What Homer actually does in exchange for this wage is well established. He sleeps at his workstation. He makes systematic errors. He has caused more nuclear incidents than any other single operator in the facility's history. He is, by the assessment of anyone who has observed him doing his job, including his own superiors, who have attempted to fire him numerous times only to be prevented by the contractual arrangement between Burns and Grandpa Simpson, one of the most catastrophically incompetent employees in the history of the profession he nominally occupies. And he keeps the job. The show's early seasons were largely honest about the economic stakes underlying Homer's employment. The anxiety about losing the job, about not being able to provide for the family, about what Homer's specific combination of limitations and the job market's specific requirements would produce if he were actually held accountable for his performance. This anxiety was a real and driving force in the emotional texture of those seasons. Homer kept the job not because he was good at it, but because the alternative was too frightening to contemplate. This anxiety is class anxiety. It is the anxiety of the working class adult who understands that their position is precarious, that their income is not guaranteed by competence, but by the specific arrangements that make their continued employment convenient for the institution employing them, and that the loss of the job would not be absorbed by the kind of safety net that would be available to someone higher in the economic hierarchy. Homer works for Burns because Burns has arranged for Homer to work for Burns. If those arrangements change, Homer has nothing. He knows this. Marge knows this. The show knows this. The power relationship between Burns and Homer is the most explicit depiction of class power in the show's narrative. Burns is not just Homer's employer. Burns is the person whose economic decisions determine whether Homer has a life, not in an abstract sense, in the direct sense that Homer's house, Homer's family's food, Homer's children's schooling are all downstream from Burns's decision to continue employing Homer. Burns doesn't know Homer's name. Homer's entire existence as an economic agent is dependent on a man who cannot identify him as an individual. This is the show's clearest statement about the working class relationship to capital. The capital doesn't know your name. The capital doesn't care about your family or your skills or your specific human qualities. The capital keeps you employed because it's convenient and will stop keeping you employed when it stops being convenient. And the only protection against this arbitrariness is the specific contractual arrangement that Homer's grandfather negotiated decades ago, an arrangement that Homer himself doesn't know about, that protects him without his knowledge or agency, that renders his job security a product of someone else's negotiation rather than anything Homer himself has done. The German Investors episode makes this explicit. When the plant was briefly owned by people who didn't have Burns's specific reasons for keeping Homer employed, the first thing they did was fire him. The incompetence that Burns tolerates because it serves his purposes was immediately intolerable to new owners who didn't share those purposes. Homer's job exists because of a deal. The deal protects Homer, and Homer has no idea this is the case. The bliss of this ignorance is not comfortable. It is the specific discomfort of watching someone be protected from a reality that would transform their understanding of their own situation if they were exposed to it. Homer thinks he has a job because he shows up to the job. He doesn't. He has a job because his grandfather made an arrangement with the man who would become his employer. The security he believes he has earned through persistence is not earned. It is administered by someone who, again, cannot remember his name. This is what the show means when it shows you that Homer cannot connect the dots between Burns's treatment of him and Burns's destruction of his family. Homer can't connect the dots not just because of cognitive damage from radiation and a crayon in his brain. He can't connect the dots because the dots were deliberately arranged to be unconnectable. Burns has constructed Homer's world so that the full picture is only visible from a position that Homer cannot occupy. The comedy of Homer's job, the sleeping at the console, the donuts during meltdown warnings, the spectacular documented failures, functions as a laugh track over the top of something that is, without the comedy, simply the description of how concentrated economic power operates. It keeps the workers dependent. It keeps the workers too compromised to effectively organize. It ensures the workers cannot afford to leave. And it does all of this while paying them a wage sufficient to make the arrangement feel like a reasonable exchange rather than an extraction. Homer is paid enough to not be desperate, not enough to be free. The line between those two conditions is where Burns keeps him with the precision of a man who has been managing this particular arrangement for more than a century and understands exactly where that line falls. The Simpsons has been making this argument since its first episode. The comedy has made it accessible. The longevity has made it comprehensive. The floating timeline has made it inadvertently timeless, in the specific sense that the conditions it depicts have not changed enough in 36 years to make it historical. Homer is still at the plant. Burns still doesn't know his name. The arrangement still holds. The comedy is still running. The argument underneath it never stops.